Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of what if Deku saw the flaws in his symbol of peace? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. All Might suddenly retransforming as he went to leave was a shocker. Not just because he had just witnessed the man that had been his idol for years deflate and inflate, but because the wind and force that his transformation seemed to kick up had sent him flying. From the top of a building. Don't get him wrong, his body had reacted in kind, tears leaking from his eyes as he struggled for breath against the force of the wind and gravity, but he couldn't seem to stop replaying All Might's words over and over in his head as he fell. Because life flashes before your eyes when you die, right? This is all his life was ever going to amount to. I cannot simply say, you can be a hero even without a power. And so Izuku would never get the chance to be a hero. Now, as he was falling from the sky, Izuku realized his dream had been nothing but something to grab hold of in the wake of everything falling apart. He had nothing other than this stupid dream that had ended up with him in this situation. Usually he would have pushed thoughts like these away. The quirkless weakling can't think things like that. How dare he call heroic stupid if he is already wasting the air that normal people breathe? But now, he allowed himself to be bitter. He was going to die, probably before he even hit the ground, and he would be added to the statistic of quirkless people committing suicide. They would never think for a moment that he hadn't killed himself. That he had never planned to. Kachan's stupid words hadn't gotten to him. He had heard worse. He let the tears falling from his face continue, because no one would save him. All Might had already wasted his precious time humoring him, and so the man was probably walking down the fire escape stairs safely, unaware of him, going the quick way down. He let out an attempt at a sob. Was this all he would ever achieve? Nothing? He is a quirkless Deku after all. But, as a last attempt at dignity, Izuku would not accept his death. He was dying for nothing, and that made him so angry. Why couldn't he get a second chance? Closing his eyes to avoid the burning gaze of the sun, Izuku let himself cry. He deserved a good breakdown. After years on end of suppressing his emotions, Izuku allowed himself to sob, to the best of his ability, as he was still struggling to breathe. These were not the drowning, unending tears known to close family and friends as the Midoriya family tears. These were bitter, unhappy tears. And somehow, these tears led to him being picked up mid-air where, from the person's posture, they had jumped from a surrounding building. Izuku kept his eyes closed, because his face was facing directly towards the sky, and he didn't want to go blind from the sun. Later, Izuku would reflect and realize that this was him preserving himself, passively understanding he was going to live. That he had gotten that second chance. Feeling the descent, Izuku figured whoever had decided to save him either had a flight quirk, it didn't feel like it, or there was a building that they were about to land on the roof of. Izuku knew how to land properly, thanks to years of escaping torment by climbing walls of alleyways and the like. He had learned the hard way that landing on your feet probably wasn't a good idea. Due to his mystery savior, his momentum had been redirected, so he wouldn't go splat if he landed correctly. He also knew that even if this person could land correctly with him in their arms, the impact on both of their bodies would be greatly increased, so he got ready to land separately. Peeking slightly with one eye, Izuku realized he had been right. Estimating the time for the landing, he adjusted his body accordingly. The person holding onto him realized what he was doing and loosened their grip slightly, ready to let go when the time was right. A couple of seconds later he was released. He positioned himself, ready to land, and when solid ground approached, Izuku leant forward, placing his palms on the ground in front of him, pushing his legs over his head and rolling out of the impact, putting his weight onto his shoulder to minimize the point of impact and decrease his momentum. It still hurt a lot, but the pain was nothing compared to being a bloodstain on the cement below him. It wasn't even the worst pain he had ever experienced. Izuku let out a wet, devastated laugh. Falling from the sky, just to land on a building forcefully, was not the worst pain he had experienced. He supposed it was due to that pain he wasn't in any more pain. But, if he hadn't been bullied, maybe he wouldn't have known to land. Maybe he wouldn't have even been falling. Wiping up his tears, Izuku didn't bother trying to stand up. He probably would have fallen down again anyway. Instead he sat cross-legged with his arms supporting his weight. Looking up, he decided to figure out who had saved him from an early death. It was a tall man with dark hair. The man had a couple of katanas strapped to his back, and was obviously not a hero. Izuku wasn't super worried. Adrenaline was one hell of a drag, and this person had just pulled him out of the sky. If they were going to kill him, they probably wouldn't have bothered with all of that. Izuku could have sworn he recognized this person. Trying as hard as he could to rack his brain for information as he evened out his breathing, Izuku took in the red scarf and headband, combat suit, and lack of a nose. Finally realizing who this was, Izuku was on edge but not worried. This was the former vigilante known as Stendhal, but now villain, Stain. The man was known for his killing spree with heroes and petty criminals. He likely wasn't interested in murdering a kid he had just put in effort to save. The real question is why? Why save him? He wasn't ungrateful. In fact, he was quite the opposite. This man, villain or not, had saved him. And Izuku was now just coming to realize truly how many shades of gray there were between the black and white heroes portrayed. He had always kind of known, of course, but even in the split seconds it took for Izuku to process everything, his mind had opened just a little more to the idea that maybe hero worship wasn't such a great idea. "Thank you," Izuku said, still staring at the man in front of him, trying to convey how grateful he truly was. The man's hard stare turned curious. That wasn't a suicide attempt, was it? It wasn't a concerned question, more a statement that he was waiting to be verified. The only thing that changed in Stain's appearance was the way that Stain was looking at him. Izuku was surprised at the observation. Most people would see a boy falling through the air crying and think suicide immediately. Somehow, Stain had figured something out. Sir." The man began muttering to himself, not unlike Izuku's own habit. And no heroes showed up. This only solidifies that heroes are only there for the show. They have no actual desire to save people. Where's All Might? Where is Endeavor? Where is Hawks? Where are any heroes? I am here to purge society of false heroes, and I save a young boy when heroes are nowhere to be seen. I need to find out what heroes have patrolled this area and done nothing. I will purge them with my blade and continue to cleanse the world of these disgusting fakes. Izuku was sure he only caught every word in that monologue because of his own muttering habit. Stendhal, or Stain, was stringing words together so fast and with such ferocity that Izuku wasn't sure what to do or how to react. Instead he just continued staring. He didn't have much else to do, what with his energy ebbing now that the adrenaline was wearing off. He noticed how his throat was dry and sore from where the sludge villain had invaded his senses. He noticed how his shoulder was throbbing from not only the burn Kaken had given him earlier, but landing on it. He noticed how his eyes were stinging from crying so much and so violently. He had thought he was going to die a total of 2 times today, and his body was reacting in kind. Stain seemed to notice the eyes on him, and paused in whatever spiral he was heading down. "You were pushed." Izuku's eyes widened. "Oh, not exactly. It's complicated." Izuku just now noticed the length of the man's tongue. He probably had a blood-related quirk then. It would also explain the man's reliance on knives and swords. His victims were also almost entirely made up of fully trained pro-heroes, so he had to have some way of causing them to go out of commission quickly. He might have a paralyzing quirk, or some kind of bodily manipulation quirk, most likely dependent on blood ingestion. That would explain his almost 100% success rate, especially if his quirk allowed him to limit the movement of his victims completely, because with the man's evident skill with knives and stealth, he could probably end the fight before it even began. But it would probably have a time limit, maybe based off of either amount ingested or blood type, so fighting multiple opponents would put him at a great disadvantage. Also, someone like Endeavor would be able to combat him through sheer force, as well as the man's inability to hold back. It was now Stain's turn to look shocked. Tilting his head to the side, some of the man's hair fell into his face. "You have some brains on you, kid. That your quirk?" Izuku had not realized he was talking out loud. And while a lot of people couldn't discern what he was saying when he muttered like he probably was just doing, the two shared the habit of muttering, so it wasn't a surprise that Stain could at least garner a basic understanding of what he was saying. And while it probably wasn't smart to disclose your quirk status to a stranger, let alone a stranger who is a serial killer ex-vigilante, Izuku felt somewhat safe telling the man. Weird. I don't have one. A quirk, that is. I don't have a quirk. The man's eyebrows shot up. And that makes it all the more impressive. Many like you do not have the creed to study quirks and mannerisms in the way you do. And here I thought you weren't aware of who I was. Compliment? Most people either patronized or straight up ignored Izuku once they found out what he was. There was also the percentage that just straight up flipped a switch and considered him a punching bag. Izuku bowed his head in respect. Thank you. This was probably a once-in-a-lifetime experience. He was treating a known villain with respect, with no fear for his life. Where has life gotten you to, Izuku? What ambitions do you have in life? A hero, perhaps? Izuku took a deep breath. Venting to serial killers would not become a habit. Looking back into the man's eyes, began talking. Just this once. Well, I've wanted to save people since I was old enough to retain a thought. All Might was always someone I've idolized. But people like me cannot be a hero. We can't even get to high school. UA is the only school that actually lets quirkless people in, and even then, not one quirkless person has ever set foot in that school as a student. So, I guess my ambitions, or whatever you want to call them, have been kind of lost along the way. I'm not entirely sure anymore. Just today, I almost died, entirely on accident, for the record, twice. The first time, All Might saved me. The second time, All Might was the reason I fell. So I can't lie, I'm a little lost. Izuku blinked slowly, exhaustion finally hitting him, full force. But I can tell you this. I want to make the world a better place, somehow. Life has always been hard for me. I want to make it a little easier for others. Stain's eyes narrowed. I have been looking for someone to pass my ideals on to. I was here merely in passing. But you, somehow, have inspired me. So, as strange as this may seem, I'm willing to take you on. As an apprentice or sorts. The man laughed. Usually I'm not so rash, nor one for sentiments such as fate, but something tells me to ask you this. Izuku had never been more shocked in his life. A man, one who had just saved him from a gory death, was offering him, a quirkless teenager, some sort of mentorship. Said man was a villain. Why was Izuku considering this? Why was his conscience, instead of telling him to run for the hills, screaming at him to say yes? This is your chance to grow strong. You gave up on rationality the moment you grabbed onto All Might's leg. You gave common sense the middle finger the moment you decided that talking to a serial killer about your ideals was a good idea. What difference does this make? Despite whatever that insane part of his brain was telling him, talking to a serial killer once and taking an offer from him is a big jump. But Izuku was a curious boy and also had exactly zero self-preservation instincts, no matter what he tried day in and day out to tell himself. So you add those two things together and what do you get? Midoriya Izuku, some sort of insane monster that God himself feared enough to refuse him a quirk. I get what you mean. Something is screaming at me to say yes. So I'll consider your offer, Stain. The taller man got paper and a pen from somewhere, scribbled something, scrunched it up and threw it at Izuku. Call me. What's your name, kid? Call me Izuku. XXXXXXXXXX, Akaguro Kaizome. Try to get a burner phone. Kaizome did not know what compelled him to offer an apprenticeship to Izuku. All he knew was that he had absolutely made the right decision. That boy had just the right amount of insanity and smarts to burn the world to the ground, and with that amount of passion that practically radiated off of him, Kaizome had no idea why the green-haired teenager had such a twisted image of himself. If he had seen that potential in just a few minutes, those who had spent their entire lives with that guy were unwise to write him off like that. But he had seen those toxic green eyes, burning with intelligence and ambitions, and he had heard how he had dissected Kaizome's quirk and weaknesses in seconds. Kaizome knows so little of this boy, but he had a peek into his life and he knows that whatever had compelled him to do what he did was something he was wise not to ignore. Izuku, whoever he is, will go far. Kaizome, even as he pretended to leave by jumping onto another rooftop, secretly watched to make sure Izuku got down safely. The slower way down. Once he watched the boy leave, he allowed himself to move on the lookout for false heroes, still contemplating the boy with shining green eyes and hair, with a wrecked middle school uniform and a tired demeanor. The boy who had sobbed not in defeat as he was falling to his death, but in anger. That boy would go far one day, and Kaizome would make FNG sure of it. When Izuku got home, he didn't bother to acknowledge his mother. She didn't bother to look up from her computer either. He supposed it was for the best. He didn't know what he would do if he had to explain the wet, wrecked uniform to her. She had never questioned his injuries before, but something she might have to replace with her own money? What would he even say? No words could describe what had happened. Once in the bathroom, Izuku checked over his injuries. He applied burn cream to the new hand-shaped burn mark on his shoulder as well as some of the older ones. That same shoulder, though thankfully not dislocated or anything, also had a growing purple bruise. After going through the process of poking the bruise a bunch to see if it hurt, and being surprised when it did, in fact, hurt every time, Izuku stuck an extra-large band-aid on his shoulder and called it a day. He didn't know what was going to come out of whatever happened after today. All he knew was that feeling that had settled deep in his chest the moment he had opened the note from Stain, or Akakuro. That feeling that things were about to change for the better. Thank whatever higher power there was out there, if there even was one. If there was one thing that Izuku knew he needed, it was a change in scenery. Also, the more Izuku reflected, the more Izuku realized that in just a day, his perspective on many things had changed. All Might being one of them. All Might had saved him from the sludge villain, but in the aftermath had been cold and borderline rude. His job was to save people and be the pillar people relied on, and he was good at his job in that aspect, but he obviously didn't think he had much of an obligation besides that. Stain, too, had saved him, after All Might's idiocy had gotten him into deep shit. But that wasn't his job. And afterwards, he had been understanding and almost, dare he say, encouraging. The man had murdered people, Izuku knew that. But he seemed to have much more solid goals than All Might did. And Izuku admired him for that. But not in the way All Might had been an idol for him. Stain was a real person. Someone that had a clear goal in mind. He didn't hide his objectives behind masks or anything of the sort. All Might was like Barbie, an unattainable standard, the picture of heroic perfection. Someone that just existed as the ideal hero in the eye of the public and not as someone that was really doing anything substantial other than causing unrealistic standards for young people. Izuku was glad he could recognize that now. It kind of helps prove to himself he was more than just his quirk status. Because if All Might could get injured to the extent he had been, no one was completely safe. But the public wasn't allowed to know that, because if they did, the world as they knew it would come tumbling down. Screw that. Izuku would keep this ace up his sleeve until he needed it, though. He wasn't exactly prepared to topple society yet. Izuku set to work taking down his All Might merchandise and dumping it in a box he found at the back of his wardrobe. He put the box in the corner of his room, and only bothered to get into clean clothes before he flopped into his bed, not even caring to slip under his new plain white covers before he fell asleep. Izuku's life had always been a routine. Wake up and get the uniform that wasn't ruined the day prior on. Get to school one way or another. Survive the school day. Sprint home before all the effort he had put into surviving the day was put to waste. Things hadn't really ever changed drastically. Sure, he had gotten better at running, but so did Kaken. The same can't be said for the other bullies, thankfully. When Izuku woke up the day after the sludge incident, it was already early in the afternoon. It was a school day. And so, naturally, Izuku panicked. But, if Inko hadn't bothered to wake him up, she probably wouldn't care if he didn't go to school. It was too late for that anyway. Izuku forced himself out of his bed despite his complaining muscles. He should help clean the house or something. Stomach growling, Izuku walked into the kitchen. He should make something easy that wouldn't be a pain to clean up. Adding to the mess wouldn't be a good idea considering he had already skipped school for the day. Throughout the afternoon, Izuku set to fix up the messes Inko had left here and there. It was the least he could do for her, considering she already had done so much for him. When he finally finished, Izuku retreated his wounds from the day before and sat at his desk completing homework. He made sure to get just enough answers right to be perfectly average. If he did too well, he would get detention for cheating, along with the detention he would get for missing class. All in all, other than the fact he was at home, he was having a pretty usual day. He slipped his phone from his pocket, planning to text Inko that he was done with all of his chores. His fingers brushed a piece of paper. It was pretty scrunched up. It suddenly hit him where this note was from. XXXXXXXXXX, Akaguro Kaizome. Try to get a burner phone. Every memory he had been suppressing since he had woke up came rushing back into his head. Continuing to stare at the note, Izuku tried to debate his decisions yesterday. Even in hindsight, he wasn't sure what had compelled him to agree to Stain's offer. He just knew that he had made the right decision. Shrugging on a light jacket, Izuku got up, scribbling a note to Inko about where he was. He pried the floorboards up from under where his All Might merch was sitting in the corner of his room. Grabbing a bunch of the cash he had squirreled away over the years, he put the floorboards back on. He headed towards the local shopping center. Thankfully, he didn't need to take the train. It was a 10-minute walk from his apartment, and he was happy to get out of the building for a little bit. Izuku counted all of the money he had on the way, and estimated he had just enough to buy a prepaid phone as well as a couple of the medicinal supplies he needed. He was as awkward as always interacting with the employees. He dodged around aisles when he noticed any of his tormentors, who had probably skipped the last couple of hours of school and ended up here. He was especially careful when he noticed his homeroom teacher. He didn't want a condescending gaze as well as unnecessary questions. He paid for what he got, and when he got back to the apartment, Inko wasn't home, but there was a note on the kitchen counter telling him there was Western-style takeout in the fridge for him. That probably indicated she was out, maybe with her new partner Izuku was yet to meet, or a couple of co-workers. The keys to the little car they owned were missing, so she was quite far away. It meant she wouldn't return drunk, though. Maybe a little hungover, if he was particularly unlucky, but not drunk. He removed the shitty packaging on the prepaid phone. He had experience with phones like this. He had almost exclusively used these types of phones until he was able to save up for a proper phone, so he wasn't worried about the settings or whatever. He input the number Stain or Akaguro, whatever he should call him, had given him. He hesitated, unsure of what to say. In the end, simplicity is key. This is Izuku. Maybe Akaguro is a bit better at social interactions. But, considering the man's occupation, that was probably wishful thinking. Kaizome was sitting in the apartment he was living out of for the week, cleaning his blade and reflecting on the day prior. Whoever Izuku was had flipped a switch in him. Kaizome had never considered himself someone to bother with sentiments such as reflection. In fact, he considered himself someone focused entirely on the future. He wasn't someone to look back. It wasn't only an image he cultivated, but a mentality he had dived head first into, back when he was a vigilante. But now, here he was, going through his conversation with a teenager he had saved from an early grave. And he knew for certain that he regretted nothing. He was sure that he had made all of the right decisions. In fact, when he eventually got into contact with the teenager again, he would figure out his living conditions for the next while. He could probably stay in the area long-term safely, but he knew that it would be a little uncomfortable. Though he was not unwilling. Anything to help grow a partner in crime, so to speak. He was willing to do things differently to help grow into someone who could continue his goal in reforming society. And then he got the message. This is Izuku. A small smile sprung onto his lips. He wouldn't answer immediately. He would finish with his blades, all the while planning on what he would do from now onwards. This was only the beginning. Katsuki was seething. Deku, that idiot, was not at school today. Katsuki hadn't thought much of it at first. The nerd was inconsequential, and he wasn't unhappy to not have to hear muttering throughout the day while he was trying to learn. Maybe if Deku actually listened during school his grades would improve. Anyway, Katsuki had gotten a text from the hag to grab some groceries on the way home from school, and he wasn't really all that keen to be yelled at for the rest of the night if he didn't do it, so he had gone. And who had he seen? F Deku. So, the nerd was alive. Big deal. The idiot nerd had been hiding from some extras when he saw him. That didn't matter. Usual behavior for him. What did matter was the sheet he was holding. Some cheap phone. Why did the nerd need that phone? He had a perfectly good one. He saw it in his back pocket. Ungrateful beach. Probably needed it so he could play games at night instead of sleeping or something. But Katsuki had to stop thinking about it because people would start thinking he cared. But, for the record, Deku was acting weird. He seemed calm, instead of his usual stupid scared self. Maybe the idiot was finally growing some ball. But it didn't matter because Deku was Deku and he should stay in his place in society. Right at the bottom. Stain had agreed to meet him at Dagoba Beach. The place was a dump, but people avoided it, so it was probably a smart place to meet, as long as you had all of your vaccines up to date. Akaguro was already there when Izuku had first arrived. They had both sat on a toppled fridge in a comfortable silence for a bit. Stain broke the silence first. Call me whatever you want. I don't care. Given name, surname, doesn't matter. I want to help you with your ambitions, and I'm willing to train you so that your bite matches your bark. The man looked to the sky. But my way of doing things allows you to figure out what you truly want along the way. You have potential. Lots of it. And we are going to turn that potential into something real. False heroes will one day be concerned with your continued existence. Inside or outside of the system doesn't matter. I know you can save people. All I need is for you to say yes. Izuku sat there shell-shocked. This man, this vigilante turned serial killer, believed in him? He had potential. He had potential. He could save people. One way or another, he could know he would save people. And so the answer was obvious. Just, thank you. Yes. He didn't even cry. It had been 3 days since then. Inko had returned, and still hadn't spoken to him at all. Kaken had retreated back to scowls and insults. He left the dirty work to his lackeys. He had stayed in contact with Stain as they had decided that they would train together every other day, until high school, where they would judge his progress and decide from there. Izuku changed his high school application at UA from hero course to general education. Akaguro's rants here and there had started his doubts in the hero system, and he had started a notebook dedicated to his research into the matter. He wanted to figure out the truth. Over a decade of hero worship didn't disappear in a day. His dreams had been shattered, yes, but he had a new dream. Fix things. And to fix things, you had to understand what was broken. He continued to disregard the fact that Akaguro had killed again since their first meeting. He still needed to figure out where he wanted to get to in life before he addressed that. Anyway, Akaguro wasn't going to kill him. It kind of bothered him that it didn't bother him, but he pushed it to the back of his mind. He had begun the process of selling his All Might merchandise. He would give some of the money to Inko. Maybe it would help improve their relationship. Spark some sort of conversation. All in all, Izuku's routine hadn't changed much. The only difference now was that he had something solid he could look forward to, and someone that seemed to believe in him. Izuku had already resolved to start running. He would start small and gradually increase it over time. He did his first one that morning. It was no longer than 20 minutes. The bite of the morning air as he ran leisurely was quite refreshing. It was probably good that he start to build a good relationship with exercise now. Before, running was all about getting away. Now it was about the future. Saving others, rather than saving himself. He also had started to build a positive relationship with himself. He allows himself to notice the lean muscles he had developed from years of escaping bullies in increasingly creative ways. He allowed himself to notice the fact his analysis was an impressive skill. Akaguro had gotten a bit annoyed when he apologized for analyzing the man's quirk after he first told Izuku what it was. Let it be known that Izuku would never call his childhood hobby creepy again. Ever. Or at least in front of Akaguro. The man was surprisingly good at aggressive positivity. He felt a little happier already, and things were only just starting out. He allowed himself to hope, just a little, that things wouldn't go back to how they were. Where Izuku just rinsed and repeated. Would that be too much to ask for? For months from the day Izuku met Stain, he came home with more bruises than usual. It was partially because he had just sparred with a man that had beaten hero after hero in a fight, but also because Kaken had come back from his hiatus of physical abuse worse than before. And Izuku knew that he was getting better at fighting, but with Kaken, he always froze just like a deer in headlights. But it could have been worse. Izuku had taken off running after school, because he was going to be late for the mixed martial arts classes he had started taking 3 times a week as well as his training with Akaguro, so he only had to deal with his tormentors before and during the school day, and for that he was glad. Inko wasn't home when he returned, but that was a non-issue. She was barely home anymore. It didn't bother him. Really, it didn't. It allowed him more time to think over what he wanted to do with his life. He knew what he wanted to do: save people. How would he do that? He still wasn't sure. Even though the training he was doing almost daily would allow him to have a fighting chance at UA, he didn't know if that was where he wanted to go. First of all, because he would have to go through the sports festival to even get to the hero course, where he would be behind when he finally got there. The entrance exam was famously unfair for people with weaker or non-physical quirks that could still be useful for hero work. Him, who had no quirk to speak of, would not be any better off. Second of all, Akaguro had brought to light the corruption that was present in the hero industry. And even if he did somehow make it to being a hero, he would probably have to go underground, or he would never be a high enough ranking hero to actually change the way anything works, like he wanted to. So, Izuku was now debating if he even wanted to be a hero. There were other ways to save people. Ways that didn't lead him being oppressively controlled by the HPSC. Vigilantism was an option. But now that Izuku's eyes had been opened, he wanted to change things for the better. And vigilantes didn't get the recognition needed to change things. Akaguro had said as much. The man had explained it as the reason he had taken to killing heroes. Despite that, Izuku didn't think what Akaguro was doing was making much of a difference. It made the heroes martyrs in the public's eyes, and despite him gaining a small following, those fans weren't out there doing anything to help. Izuku had told Akaguro this, and as a result, the man had taken a break from his mission so he could try and figure things out. Izuku had been shocked at this, because no one had really ever heard him in the way Akaguro had. It hurt a little to realize this now. Izuku went through the normal routine of dressing and treating his wounds, taking out the burn cream for the first time in a while. He didn't allow himself to be angry though. He kept his eyes on the future, still considering what he could do while he finished his homework, as he had taken to doing these last few months. A while later, while he was researching the hero that Akaguro had been ranting about lately, he heard the door opening. It probably meant that Inko was home, or they were being robbed. He poked his head out of his bedroom to check, and he realized it was Auntie Mitsuki. Not one of the options, but better than being robbed. Taking his headphones out of his ears, he exited his room to go talk to her. "Hello, Auntie. Ink Mum isn't here right now, she's out. Do you need anything?" The woman smiled. "Such a polite boy, as always, Izuku-chan. I was just here to check up on you. Inko-chan asked me to." Izuku was instantly confused. Inko probably wouldn't ask Mitsuki to check up on him. She never called him or Inko-chan, either. It was unlike her to use honorifics at all. Her tone was all wrong. Frowning, he gripped the throwing knife he kept on him at all times now. It was in a holster on his waist, hidden underneath his baggy shorts. He had learned basic skills with knives quickly, thankfully, and was confident enough in his abilities to injure the intruder enough to incapacitate them. "You're not Auntie. Who are you?" he asked, narrowing his eyes suspiciously. The intruder's eyes widened at being called out. They eyes his hand, which was shallowly in his waistband. The person recognized the threat, pulling out a knife of their own. The disguise slowly started shifting off of them, revealing someone with blue hair. They weren't wearing Mitsuki's clothes, but a black form-fitting t-shirt and jeans. So, an illusionary quirk. Not a transformation one, as he had previously thought. "You are too smart for your own good, kid. Give up while you're ahead," the intruder said, lowering themselves into a fighting stance. "It's a kill or be killed world, and you just aren't strong enough." Before the intruder could even move an inch, Izuku whipped out the knife he had already been holding and aimed it for his opponent's hand, the one that was holding the knife. It landed. The intruder let out a little shriek of pain, dropping the knife instinctually. Izuku ran forwards and dove for the knife. He needed another weapon now. His was safely in his opponent's palm. He stood up quickly, noticing the intruder's angering expression. Someone blinded by anger would be a less organized opponent, though they could be more forceful. That was a mistake, Izuku-chan. The intruder spat out his name like it tasted bad in their mouth. The intruder seemed more built for agility than brute force, at face value. But he wouldn't underestimate this person, since they knew his name and were obviously trained in some capacity based on their physical appearance. And strangely, they seemed to hold a grudge. But this was not something that immediately set off large red flags in his mind. He was a large target for discrimination due to his lack of a quirk, and their words seemed to correlate with his weakness, so it was plausible that their hatred was simply close-mindedness. But they knew his name and Inko's name, too. They also knew of his family's relationship with Auntie Mitsuki. That was concerning, and why someone he didn't even recognize had put in the effort to break into his apartment, but he pushed it to the back of his mind for now, focusing on the kick coming his way as the intruder righted themselves. Izuku had instinctively put some distance between him and his opponent, but they had closed the distance while he was distracted, and this kick was going to hit him if he didn't move. He caught the side of the intruder's boot, which wouldn't have been an issue if the boot hadn't been reinforced. His already sore body screamed in pain, but he couldn't let himself freeze. He blocked another kick, catching it, and pushing the intruder away as they drew a small knife from their waistband. This was not Kaken, and Izuku knew that. He was not useless here in his own house. He was not Deku. Not here. He darted towards his opponent, planning to graze the upper forearm of his opponent, so he could distract and disarm them, but they ducked, probably planning to dodge him and hit him in the back, and Izuku quickly repositioned himself. But too late, Izuku realized where he was now aiming. And due to the change of direction, the knife was going to land a lot more forcefully. And if he tried to change his trajectory, he would only do more damage. The knife landed right in the intruder's shoulder, where the subclavian artery should be. And as his momentum caused him to continue moving, the knife came with him. The intruder would be dead within minutes, but Izuku couldn't find it in himself to move. He tried, but his body didn't move. Move, Izuku, or they're dead. If you don't move, you have their blood on your hands. Even as he saw the bright red blood pulsate from his attacker's body as they sobbed violently on the floor. But this sadness was not because of the physical pain. That much was obvious from how they were trying to get up, through the pain, glaring fathers at him through their watery eyes. It's a kill or be killed world, and you just aren't strong enough. This person was devastated because Izuku had been the one to kill them. Because he was weak. He was Deku. He just stared, wide-eyed. He froze. This was not Kaken, and he was not the one on the floor, dying, but he still froze. And suddenly he was reminded of something that had happened years ago. Izuku was on his chair, gripping an All Might figurine like it was his lifeline as his mother stared down at him, tearing up, but not in the drowning, snotty way that was the Midoriya tears. These were tears of guilt. I'm sorry, Izuku. Is this how Inko had felt back then? Because Inko had felt guilty. So, Izuku felt nothing. He was not crying. He was just looking on as this person died. Looking down as this person died. What had this person even done to deserve this? Kick him a couple of times? Impersonate Auntie? But still, Izuku could not find any emotion that he could describe. He just wanted to feel something, so he knew what was happening. Why did he feel so strong, yet so helpless? The stranger had gotten to their knees by now, and they attempted to stand, not even trying to block the blood flowing from their shoulder. They chucked their knife at him weakly and it missed. You have no right. You are weak, and you will never get anywhere in life, you Deku. He saw as the light left the stranger's eyes with those last words. He felt a surge of hatred, as the stranger called him weak, called him useless. Cursed his name with their dying breath. But Deku, you cannot hate the strong when you are weak. Out of nowhere, a smaller voice spoke in the back of his head. But I killed them, didn't I? So are they really strong if I'm weak? But still he did not move. Izuku did not know how long he stood there. His feet hurt. Everything hurt. Finally, he forced his arm to move, reaching for the prepaid phone, the fifth or so by now, that had Akaguro's number in it. He called. Neither he nor Akaguro liked calling, but he felt like this needed some sense of familiarity. Izuku, what happened? A crackly spoke from the phone. A sob broke from his lips. Finally something. But he still didn't cry. Why couldn't he just cry, goddammit? He just killed someone. Izuku, what happened? More forceful now. Izuku stared down at the body before him. They're dead. I killed them. I killed them. Akaguro, they're dead and I didn't even know their name. There was silence. Izuku, where are you? Home, he said, gripping the bloody knife for dear life. His hand went numb. He was reminded of the All Might figurines that he had once worshipped. Now they all were in the hands of others. But this was not a toy. This was a weapon. A deadly weapon with the blood of another on it. Hopefully Akaguro wouldn't hate him for this. The man was like an older brother to him. He didn't want it to end. Things were finally working out, and now he had to go and do this. Where's home? My location? I'll send you my location. A apartment 203 inch. He really was a Deku. He could barely hold himself together. He had no right to wallow in despair as his victim laid dead on the floor of his home, unable to feel anything. He couldn't even do anything right. He sent Akaguro his location, his movements feeling sluggish and off. He heard Akaguro moving in the background. Neither hung up. Izuku heard the sounds of his mentor, his friend, whatever he was, sprinting. He heard confused shouts from a passersby here and there too, but that wasn't what bothered him. Why was Akaguro staying worried for him? That's what he thought it was anyway. But it might not be worry. His mother's worry was very different. This was not suffocating like Inko's worry had been. Felt nice. But then he looked at the corpse in front of him and reminded himself that he was not supposed to feel nice right now. Kaizome did not bother with pleasantries such as knocking when he arrived at Izuku's home. He was unaware of what had happened or why, but all he needed to know was that horrible sound that Izuku had let out on the phone, and the panicked words he had blurted out without context. He opened the door, just loud enough to alert Izuku that he was here. He hadn't known what to expect. It was not this. A stranger with midnight blue hair lay on the floor, in what would obviously be an uncomfortable position. It was obvious that they had fallen. Izuku had not killed them while they were on the floor. He did not know if that made it better. There was quite a bit of blood. Enough that Kaizome struggled to tell where it all came from. But Kaizome had seen blood before. He had killed people before. What truly disturbed him was Izuku. Thankfully, judging from the way the blood pooled around the corpse on the floor, none of it was Izuku's. When Kaizome had first killed someone, he had spiraled into a depression, his hero complex shattered. Izuku, on the other hand, seemed borderline catatonic. What irked him most was that there wasn't guilt. There was sadness, panic, but not guilt. The young boy was simply standing there, phone in one hand, bloody knife in the other, completely still. Izuku, is anyone home? He looked up, seemingly noticing him for the first time. Shaking his head, the teenager simply said, "They're dead." His voice was laced with fear. The fear was not of what he had done, Kaizome noted. It was of what Kaizome himself would think. He almost laughed right then and there. He had killed people before. Why would Izuku think his opinion of the boy would change? But it scared him too. And despite how much effort it took to admit that, he was scared. Because why was this person even here in the first place? They had obvious professional gear on them. Steel-toed boots. Not some lowlife thug. And Izuku had mentioned not knowing them. But that was a problem for the future. Kaizome took the phone from Izuku's hand, hanging up the call. He gently guided Izuku to the countertop that was in the kitchen and sat him down on a stool. He then locked the door and barricaded it with the coffee table. It would not be great if Izuku's parents came in at a time like this, considering the dead person on the floor and the serial killer in their living room. He went back to Izuku and stood on the opposite side of the counter. "Izuku, if you could tell me what happened, that would be great." He leaned his weight against the bench. Izuku told him in a monotonous voice. The excruciating detail told him that this night would not be easily forgotten. There would be nightmares. Horrible, horrible nightmares. He had them himself. You should know. So, the person had disguised themselves as someone close to his family. They had said something that informed the boy that it wasn't the real person, but they knew his name. And a nickname of his, apparently. This was not random, and that wasn't good. But Kaizome had a responsibility to help Izuku in this moment, not a responsibility to figure this out. Or hide the body. Izuku had a future, and if Kaizome had to take the fall for this, he would, even if it would shatter his image in the eyes of the public and the heroes. He had to comfort Izuku, somehow, so he did what he thought would help. Izuku, I hope you understand this. That person probably would have killed you. Or hurt you. They might have hurt others too. Before this or after this. So think of it like this. This might not have been the best way, but it wasn't without cause. So this wasn't senseless murder. You can't change the past. So change the future. You can do so much. I know it. So don't forget that sometimes you just have to push forwards. Izuku's looked up, eyes laced with tears. But, Akaguro, I don't feel guilty. And that's what's bothering me. I know I should. But I don't. And that's what hurts the most. The boy wiped away tears. The fact I was weak enough to let that happen. To let myself slip like that. That's why I'm Deku. Useless, quirkless Deku. Kaizome frowned. That nickname again? It suddenly dawned on him. Deku, as in Dekunibu? Useless doll? He didn't really know what to say to that. But he had to say something. Having a serial killer comfort someone over something like this was probably not smart, but it was what had happened, so be it. He walked around the kitchen island, putting a tentative hand on Izuku's shoulder. You are not Deku. You are not useless. If you insist on calling yourself that, think of it as Dekairu. You can do it, seems much more fitting to me, you know? Because this may have been a screw-up, but you will move past this. If you think this was a moment of weakness, use it to become stronger. Improve. You can and will do this. Kaizome wanted so badly to say that he knew it. But Izuku needed to be independent. His intelligence was off the charts, but it won't amount to anything if he can't think for himself. And as much as this was not the right time, it was the begging of that journey to self-worth. As much as it might seem like Izuku gets his worth from others. Validation, that's wrong. He gets it from seeing his own strength. Izuku looked him in the eye, with some new determination. I'll do it. I'll become stronger. I'll save people. I have to make a difference or die trying. Izuku said, wiping away the last of his tears. There's the ambition I saw in you that day. Now, let's get you cleaned up. Your parents coming back soon. Kaizome watched Izuku as he went through all of the stages of grief in a mere hour. He had searched the body and found a lot of weapons. The intruder had even had a gun, by some miracle, but it was unloaded. That suggested that they either had connections with the government or the remaining dregs of the Yakuza. This wasn't looking any better. He wondered what exactly this person had come to achieve. They obviously had some goal other than petty robbery. And while it was worrying, they were dead. There were no further answers to be found. He explained as much to Izuku, who almost punched a hole in the wall when he heard it. The kid's emotions had been all over the place. To be expected, he supposed. What was going on in the kid's head was a mystery. His toxic green eyes were swirling with confusion, anger, and exhaustion all at once as he looked up at Kaizome from his spot slumped against the wall he had just tried to destroy. Akaguro, do you think they were here to harm me, or my mother? He frowned before sliding down the wall to sit beside Izuku. I don't know. But it is a possibility. It's in the past now, though. Don't worry about it too much. He replied, pushing a dark hair away from his eyes. Izuku looked him dead in the eye, toxic eyes oozing with exhaustion. I have every right to worry, and I will. But Izuku's voice broke. I won't let it overtake me. I promise. Kaizome cracked a smile. As much as it was inappropriate in this situation, he marveled at the abilities and inner strength of this boy, despite everything. Go to sleep, Izuku. Or at least rest. I'll clean up this mess. He stood back up. No. I won't be able to sleep, and you know that. I killed them. I'm helping. Izuku allowed himself to be helped up by Kaizome, a determined look in his eyes. Izuku's mood swings were something he had gotten used to. But at times like this, Kaizome saw the deep sadness that seemed to have settled in the boy. And it hurt. Kaizome had been like this himself when he was Izuku's age. He had long since let that all go, but he understood at the very least. Blood quirks were never all that popular with the public. And as much as he had fought against the stereotypes, he was a villain, just like his teachers and peers had told him he would be. But this was for the betterment of society. So kids like him, and kids like Izuku, would get a happy childhood, instead of their peers being warped by the ideals of false heroes. Even All Might wasn't a true hero, not anymore. And that was why the two were standing here today. Standing together. For the future. It's a catchphrase the two had come up with. It had come out of the blue, but they liked it. It helped them when they discussed morality, especially. And Hell knew that more of those talks were coming in the future. And yes, this was not a good situation. Not at all. But there was no going back. But they would make do. And Izuku would heal. All he could do was watch as someone with midnight blue hair stabbed him, over and over and over, screaming, "You don't deserve to kill me." But it wasn't their voice. It was younger. It reminded him of something. Take a swan dive off the roof of the building and... Suddenly the stranger with midnight blue hair and a young boy with blonde hair and crimson eyes became one and the same. "Kaken, I'm sorry Kaken. I didn't mean to." He sobbed out. "Thirtsa. The knife dug into his stomach further, until his guts and blood were everywhere, but that blood wasn't his, and thirtsa. When he woke up, his throat was hoarse and his cheeks were soaked with tears. Akaguro was in the doorway, with a glass of water in hand. Noticing he was awake, the man walked in and handed him the glass. Propping himself up, Izuku gulped down the water, hoping it would ease his sore throat. Neither said a thing for a moment. It was comfortable silence, though, so he didn't mind. "I'm sorry," he said softly, putting the now empty glass on his bedside table. Glancing at the clock, he frowned. It had only been an hour and a half since he had tried to go to sleep. It had felt like so much longer. Take a swan dive off of the roof. He was falling, dead before he even hit the ground, all because of All Might. He was no stranger to nightmares, of course, but that nightmare seemed to cause physical pain. He brushed his fingers across his midriff. He was reminded of the pain he felt in the dream. It had felt so He was sorry that he had to inflict real pain on another person. Here came the guilt he had been missing the day previously. Or that night. Whatever it was. But would he do it again? He felt the sick coming before he even tasted it, and Akaguro, noticing his discomfort, grabbed his bin and held it out for him. He reached into the bin full of old, scribbled-out paper. The vomit came out of his nose as well as his mouth, and left a burning, gross sensation behind. He was reminded of the sensation of the sludge villain, in his mouth, nose, suffocating him. He was dying, and it was fine because he was Deku, useless, expendable. He vomited again, before dry heaving into the bucket for a while. Akaguro had left at some point, and Izuku hadn't even noticed. It was fine though, because the man had already done so much for him, and he probably looked disgusting right now, so. Akaguro came back with a wet cloth. He put it on the back of his neck. "You have a bloody nose. This is supposed to help," the man said, matter of fact, placing his hands on his hips. Izuku waited until his nose stopped bleeding. Standing up precariously, he said, "I'm going to have a shower. I really need one." Akaguro nodded, and then walked out, closing the door behind him. Izuku sighed. Grabbing his towel and a change of clothes, he headed for the bathroom. He put the water on the hottest setting and scrubbed his skin until it was raw. He scrubbed himself with his hands, his nails occasionally biting into his skin, leaving small marks. He got the dirt out of every crevice, under every nail. He washed his hair over and over until his head hurt, and when he was done he simply turned off the water and stood in shower for a while. He got into his clothes, the fabric feeling out of place and odd on his skin. He sat in his room stretching out his sore muscles. He must have been very tense as he slept. Well, it was a good thing that he had managed to perfect the art of stretching muscular pain out throughout his years of sprinting long distances. He got a massage ball and started massaging out the pain in his back. That's when Akaguro came back. He smelt like bleach. Not unexpected. Not really. He had smelt like bleach too, before his shower. Blood and vomit too. But his distaste for the scent must have shown on his face, because the man chuckled, leaning on the doorframe as Izuku finished massaging his back. "I'll be out of here soon, don't worry. I'm just waiting for your mother to come back, and then I'm gone. Can you tolerate my stench until then?" Izuku sighed in relief. Not because Akaguro would be leaving soon, but because he knew that Inko would be back in half an hour or so. He didn't want to worry him. "You already worried him, Deku." He ignored the voice in the back of his head. It was usually for the best. The two of them played cards in Izuku's room, uncomfortably close to the wall, and therefore the window, so Akaguro could book it at a moment's notice. He knew that if you had told Izuku's from 6 months ago that he would be sitting in his room playing cards with a serial killer, who cared? And he was completely calm, he would have had a full-blown crisis. He let out a small snort as he looked through his cards. Akaguro smirked. At that moment, they both heard the key throning in the lock. Izuku got up to greet his mother, hopefully, this time wait, don't think about it, while Akaguro packed up the cards and the rest of his stuff, ready to leave. He walked in just as Inko put her bag down on the couch. "Hi, Mum." He waved awkwardly. He had never tried to initiate the conversation before, but now was probably as good a time as any to rebuild things between them. Inko was using her quirk to attract some lip balm towards her. Suddenly she stopped, the lip balm dropping to the floor. She looked up at him. And in her viridian eyes, all he saw was hatred. She raised her hand slightly. All he saw was Kaken. And he froze. Inko was having a bad day. Her boss had been making uncomfortable comments to her all day, and Sadashi had broken up with her this morning. That bestiardy couldn't even say to my face. Had to do it through his mistress. And then Izuku had the nerve to speak with her. Inko wasn't sure why Izuku was still here, to be honest. She had tried to make it clear that he was free to leave whenever he wanted. Yet he always stayed. She tried not to mind most of the time. She was a good mother, after all. Good mothers didn't kick out their children. But she was not in the mood for Izuku's bullshit right now. She told him so. She made sure to DSPLN him as well. She would not have disobedient children, especially if they are as fragile as Izuku. That was a recipe for a dead child. And she was a good mother. So, Izuku would learn. She had coddled him for years. If this shocked him, he had a lot of learning to do. And he wanted to be a hero. But she wasn't going to take the time to teach a child that was going nowhere. A little DSPLN here and there would do him good though. She started to make herself some tea, hoping to ward off the faint scent of bleach that was hanging around. She sighed. At least Izuku was being a good boy and doing his own laundry. A few seconds passed as Inko started doing things around the kitchen as she waited for the water to boil. Izuku spoke up. "Please do not hit me, Inko." He spat out her name like it hurt to say. "You have no right." Inko felt her eyes widen. She turned towards her son. "Midoriya Izuku. You cannot act so rudely towards your mother." Looking Izuku in the eyes, she noticed a few emotions flickering through, though it was too fast to understand or process. And she had never been too good at reading people anyway. But she did see something after a while, and even if she was rather bad at social interactions, she knew what this was. Her son had finally snapped. It was not her fault. Kaizome was about to leave, finishing packing up the last of the cards, when he heard the distinct sound of skin on skin that signified a slap. Not one that would have been too painful, but one that would have shocked anyone on the receiving end. He carefully peeked out the door, to check what had happened. He wasn't an idiot. He had noticed how Izuku avoided the topic of his parents. He frankly knew nothing, but he didn't trust whoever was out there enough for that to have been a joking hit. He saw Izuku standing by the couch, blank-faced as the woman he assumed was his mother lowered her hand. "Don't speak to me right now, Izuku. I'm not in the mood for this." The woman sighed, walking into the kitchen, starting to potter around. Izuku was just staring at the woman, wide-eyed. He seemed to snap out of whatever trance he was in, raising his hand to his face, gently touching where he had been hit. Kaizome was very close to walking out of the room and shanking Izuku's mother right then and there. He hated parents who hurt their kids, physically or mentally didn't matter. Instead, he stood and watched as Izuku seemed to recover from his shock. From this angle, Kaizome couldn't see too much of his facial expression, but he could feel the mix of anger and terror radiating off of Izuku from his spot, hidden behind the door. What an interesting mix. Kaizome knew Izuku as a stubborn kid, who obviously had some serious self-esteem issues, but was still trying to figure out his place in the world, just like any other teenager. But with so much hate directed his way, due to something he couldn't control, no less. Stupid heroes, encouraging discrimination, Izuku was quite obviously a force of nature. Whatever side of the law Izuku eventually ended up on, there would be hell to pay for those who opposed him. He knew that Izuku would end up on a side too, because the teen was not someone to stand back while shit went on around him. He was not made for just sitting around and watching as the world burned. And while Kaizome had never said this aloud, he knew why Izuku wasn't granted a power by whatever higher force there was. Izuku would have been too much for the world. During their training together, Izuku had learned skills that had taken Kaizome himself months to master in mere weeks. It was scarily impressive, and he had commented on it a multitude of times. Every time, Izuku had grown flustered and waved it off, which was something he had taken note of. It was endearing the way he wasn't aware of his skills, to say the least, even if it was slightly concerning. But the fact still stands. The kid was crazy impressive. The heroes had missed out. But he was getting distracted. What he was trying to say was that Izuku could probably burn the world to the ground if he wanted to, and with the way he was acting, Kaizome was worried that the boy had finally snapped and was ready to light a match. Kaizome personally wasn't one for arson, but lighting trash on fire wasn't much of an issue. Izuku was not sure what he was feeling. He knew what had happened. Inko had hit him. And he knew he had said something, but his mouth was on autopilot and he was stuck inside his own head. Izuku knew that Inko didn't love him. He had known for a while. But there was a difference between knowing and knowing. He had been optimistic. He cleaned, did his chores, left her be, hoping it would fix things. But nothing changed. In the beginning, after his diagnosis, Inko had wrapped him in bubble wrap and sheltered him from the world. "You are fragile, Izuku," she had said, every day for months. But then she had given up. It was like she had flicked a switch and suddenly what had been too much became nothing. And he had tried so hard to win back her love. He was still trying. But when she had raised her hand to hit him, all he could think of was Kaken. All he could think of was Deku. "You don't deserve to kill me." He had pushed the nightmare and the day prior from his mind as long as he could, but he knew a couple of hours was not long enough to bury something that bad. And as much as his body screamed at him to defend or attack, or crawl up in a ball on the floor and hope that death takes him, he didn't move. Because all he saw was crimson eyes, crimson blood. But as he calmed himself, he remembered where he was, and who he was with. His mother. He raised his hand to his cheek, inspecting the site her hand had hit its mark with his fingers. It didn't hurt physically, sure. But it all added up. Years of neglect added up. And when he looked over it all, he couldn't understand why. Why did he deserve this? If only he had a quirk. That's how he had always thought. Somehow, he wished that magically he would manifest some awesome, flashy quirk. Then, maybe he would be accepted by Kaken. Accepted by his mother. Accepted by All Might. But, in the words of the #1 hero himself, hope would get him nowhere. He looked at Inko. Really looked at her. She was the same as she had always been. He could see her justifying her actions as she made her tea and wiped up the bench. Lowering his hand from his face, he made eye contact with his mother. Not the woman who had raised him. She didn't exist. He had raised himself. And he had done a great job, thank you very much. Izuku allowed himself to feel the anger, instead of shoving it away to some place that would eventually overflow. He let it run through him, adding gasoline to the fire that had been lit since he had been thrown off of a roof. He allowed himself to understand that this woman was not his mother. His mother died the day she decided that quirkless meant worthless. The day she decided Izuku was Deku. She had never outright called him the nickname. She barely referred to him at all. She was aware of it, though, and never corrected his teachers when they called him that during parent-teacher meetings. That was enough. But Akaguro had said something last night, and although he was panicked and definitely high on adrenaline, he remembered it. He was not Deku. He was Dikairu. And so he allowed himself to scold his mother. He held back a manic laugh. Free therapy, scolding your own parents. You have never cared for me. Don't fool yourself. I can see it in your eyes that you are telling yourself that you are in the right. If you are going to ignore me my entire life, be proud of it. Izuku knew that he wasn't thinking straight. He hadn't slept well for a while, and he had murdered someone last night, for God's sake. Izuku knew that he sounded like he was holding back tears. Really, he was holding back the urge to just go insane. Kill his mother and then himself. He had already killed one person, what was a couple more? But he couldn't do that. He wanted to help people, and him being dead wouldn't do anything. He would help everyone. Even if he took a bullet through the brain, he would make sure that he either died making sure that things were on their way to being better, or he would soldier on. He had lived this long. And after that, he would make sure that at least one kid, somewhere, would not have to deal with a mother that had given up. Just one would be enough. Inko didn't respond quickly. He clenched his fists to his side. Even from where he was standing, he looked straight into her eyes. God, it had been a while since he looked into those viridian eyes. The last time had probably been when he was 4. Hopefully this will be the last time. He never wanted to see Inko again. He had realized that she wasn't worth chasing after. Maybe Kaken was worth it either. Get out. Inko whispered as if it was painful. She turned away to attend to her tea. He didn't say a word as he walked back to his room. He wanted to cry and scream and burn something to the ground. He settled with taking the knife that was sitting on his dresser next to a pack of cards and carving his name into the plaster on his wall. Dikairu. It was messy and half-butted, but who cared? If he hit his point across it would be fine. He noticed Akaguro's presence, but didn't acknowledge it. He had too much going on in his mind to do anything other than pack his tattered, shitty, yellow bag. Eventually, he couldn't do anything more. He sat down on his bed and let his emotions do what they wanted. Akaguro let him cry. Inko did not stay in her apartment for long after she told her son to leave. She wasn't going to wait. Hopefully he'd be a good boy and obey his mother this one last time. The boy. She sighed. When she had gotten P-Arginin tea with Izuku, she hadn't been ready for a child. And, when Hisashi left for America, she had become a single mother to a quirkless child. That was a lot of pressure. But she considered herself a strong woman, and so she had gotten a divorce, and had tried her best to keep her son safe. But Izuku was a lot of work. He had unrealistic expectations and dreams. So she had given up when she had gotten a better-paying job. Children learn just fine on their own, and this way they both get the necessary things to live. Exposing him to the world was a mercy on her part. Maybe then he might amount to something she had thought at the time. Oh, she lamented how very wrong she was. She was currently in the Bakugo household, making small talk with Mitsuki. The woman was a lifesaver. And now she no longer had the weight of Izuku on her shoulders. She could enjoy her free time with her longtime best friend. Inko? What's got you all sappy now? Mitsuki flicked her shoulder good-naturedly. Inko smiled back at her warmly, taking a swig of the beer she had in her hand. Nothing bad. Just happy I've finally tied off some loose ends. Good for you. Now all you need is to get rid of your crappy boss and we're all good, my friend. Mitsuki leaned into her shoulder, smelling strongly of the red wine the blonde has just downed. She rolled her eyes. One step at a time. But now, she was a little more free. Izuku was no longer her concern. And thank the Lord for that. Kaizome steered Izuku into the apartment he was renting, semi-legitimately, but anyway. Izuku looked around, snickering. You do realize the moment a hero walks in here you're in deep shit, right? Izuku jokes, pointedly looking at the stack of blades in the corner. He glared back at Izuku. His apartment was not going to be found by heroes. And where did this sarcasm come from? 5 months ago this kid hadn't uttered the word F in his life, and here he was making fun of a serial killer, with no care in the world. But he guesses it's fair, after what he just saw. Very fair. Life had not dealt Izuku any good cards, and yet he still manages to play the game better than anyone he knew. Kaizomi watches as Izuku continues assessing his surroundings. Once the boy deems the space worthy of his time, he sat down on the only clear spot on the couch. BS30. Clearing out the blades that were chucked on the couch? Carelessly, yes. But when Izuku calls you crying late at night you hardly have time to properly store them. But he's still a BS30. Kaizomi put them away, making sure they wouldn't fall off of their place propped up on the wall. By then, Izuku was playing on his actual phone. Some stupid candy game. He watched as Izuku played for a bit, even trying to play a couple of times. Kaizomi could tell that Izuku was exhausted, but they both knew sleep wasn't going to come easy. So, he started collecting some of the things they used for training, stuffing them in a cheap duffel bag. Come on you Bistudi, we're going to spar. Izuku finished his stretches just as Akaguro finished setting up. He knew what Akaguro was doing by bringing him out here to spar, and he was grateful. He was restless, despite being tired, and desperately needed something to do. The two of them were at Dagoba Beach, within a clearing the two of them had made in the trash. There was an easy-to-access exit entrance, but the rest of it was set up so that the surrounding trash would prevent them from being seen. At first Izuku had been a little nervous about the illegal thing, but things had changed quite a bit since then. First of all, he had started to learn to code a little bit, and had managed to gain entry-level access to the public security cameras in his area. The rush that he had got from that had presented the idea that legality wasn't always the best thing. And yes, he did feel bad that he was getting enjoyment from committing crimes, but he had found a bunch of dirt on both normal civilians. Don't negotiate your divorce in public please, villains and heroes alike. Years upon years of hero worship don't go down the drain in one night, but he had seen enough heroes do horrible things, both in person with Akaguro and through a screen to believe that there needed to be a serious change in pace. He understood why Akaguro started culling heroes in the first place, even if some bits were questionable, but at the same time his message was getting mixed up and diluted by his fans, as well as hero commission propaganda. Getting into a fighting stance, Izuku mentally prepared himself to be beaten into the ground by Akaguro. He couldn't compare to the man that had taken down hero after hero. But he was getting better because he was getting better. The two of them circled each other, searching for an opportunity to strike. Akaguro moved first, but Izuku was quick to duck, countering with a kick to the shins, before moving backwards to create space. Akaguro was a paragon in the realm of close combat, but Izuku was quirkless, so he didn't have anything to use to keep his distance. His best bet was usually to wear down his opponent, but due to that potentially wearing him down as well, he was learning how to strike fast and end any fight quickly. So he was working on both his endurance and strength. Akaguro's fighting style was sporadic, but calculated. It had been developed to keep trained pros on their toes, and was effective. But when you had been taught by him, his movements seemed a lot less random. So, Izuku noticed when Akaguro made to lunge. He recognized this move. The man would roll and then kick his feet from under him. It had worked so many times, much to Izuku's chagrin, but Izuku was determined to dodge this time. If he was lucky, he might get the chance to counter. Just as Akaguro ducked into his roll, Izuku hit the mat, making sure he was in control of his balance, rather than being knocked out of it by the swinging kick. Pushing himself next to where Akaguro was trying to get up, Izuku pounced, the spars soon devolving into a free-for-all wrestling match. Izuku enjoyed this part of sparring too, because, quote, one Akaguro Kaizomi, fighting dirty is absolutely a necessary skill. Don't be an idiot. What if you get kidnapped by someone with a skin-hardening mutation quirk? You've got to be prepared to go for the eyes. Izuku had always been slightly bothered by Akaguro's oddly specific tips and tricks, but he was smart, so he usually listened. Usually. There was eye-poking, hair-pulling, knees to the gut and trash thrown. In the end, there was no conclusive winner. Both of them lay on their back on the ground, side by side, one panting, the other half asleep. But they were both smiling because right here, at that moment, nothing bad was happening. Naomasa frowned down at the file that had been placed on his desk this morning. He had been procrastinating all day, and now this was what he was left to look into. It was relatively thin, full of only a few photos as well as basic observations. It was a murder, a 21-year-old Jane Doe. It seemed like they were associated with some sort of Yakuza group, as a hitman. The question was, why was the hitman dead? There were a few options. 1. They betrayed the group and were killed, gory but unfortunately not uncommon. 2. They were sent to kill someone who in turn killed them, or some enemies of theirs killed them. They had almost no wounds other than the one that killed them, a stab wound to the shoulder. They had nothing on them, but there was several sheaths for blades and a holster for a gun, but nothing other than their clothes, and those sheaths were found on the body. The body was found in the back of a hairdresser's, so any of the DNA on the body wasn't really trustworthy. The body was found in a ripped open garbage bag full of hair. Smart on the killer's part, but absolutely a pain for the detectives. Honestly, this seemed like a classic turf war, and it probably wouldn't come to anything, but it was something he should warn some underground heroes to keep an eye on. He moved on, flicking through a file he knew hadn't changed in about 3 months. The hero killer, Stain. The man was previously a vigilante, but had taken to killing heroes he didn't consider worthy. That was pretty much any hero, but had stopped all traceable activity recently. Considering the man's occupation, it wasn't unreasonable to consider that he was dead in a ditch somewhere. But to Naomasa, it felt like the calm before the storm. He didn't know why. In fact, it had absolutely no evidence backing it. It was purely an intuitive feeling. He shouldn't trust it. But yet, every day he looked back at this file and felt worried. Actually no, screw that. Naomasa was scared. Shoyuta did his normal patrol. It was the same as every other night, pretty much. He stuck to the shadows, relishing in the fact that it was quiet for once. And it wasn't the type of quiet he should be concerned about, either. It was just as if even the criminals, the drunks, and the villains had all just decided tonight was once to rest. The calm before the storm, maybe, but he didn't think anything too sinister was happening yet. And so he breathed a breath of fresh air. Maybe the year to come at UA would be a peaceful one. Or maybe he would expel everyone on the first day again. Who knows? But the prospective students seem interesting enough. He was content enough in the safety of the area around him that he didn't notice the dark ponytail slipping away down the alleyway he had been hovering above, and nor did he notice the head of curly hair searching through trash at Dagoba Beach. But that was his concern yet. So he could sleep easy for now. Izuku was staring at the blueprints for a basic firearm, fiddling with the parts in front of him. In all honesty, he was clueless. He had no idea what he was doing. He had never constructed anything like this before. But he really wanted a gun. They were dangerous, yes, but efficient if he could figure out how to use one. In the age of quirks, people didn't expect guns. They weren't really prepared for them anymore. Even a mutant quirk couldn't survive a bullet in the brain. It could also be used to mask his quirkless status. Even though he highly doubted it, maybe one day he could simply claim he had a marksmanship quirk. It would make it a whole lot harder to track down who he was. Not that it mattered, considering he wasn't even planning on continuing his civilian lifestyle anymore anyway. A gun would be more than useful. But they were very hard to obtain, and so, here he was, using the fact that many criminals used Dagoba Beach to dump random stuff to his advantage. He had also used the meager hacking skills he had obtained to access a gun licensing database to find blueprints for a gun. And maybe the Izuku from 5 months ago would have been mortified at the idea of wielding a gun, or any kind of weapon. Hell, even the Izuku from a week ago would have been shell-shocked. But multiple sleepless nights, stewing over things had helped him come to realize that, because he was quirkless, and even more so now that he was associated with Akaguro, that he would have to fight to survive. Aim for the kill before someone else does first. And as much as it pained him to think of what he had done that night, he understood that it was kill or be killed. He didn't know why that person had shown up at his doorstep, nor who they were. But he knew that only one of them would have walked out alive. And Izuku would not die. He couldn't let himself die. Because there was so much wrong in this world. And he was dead if he wasn't going to try and fix it. But heroes were puppets. They couldn't get anything done. Not when the HPSC controlled everything they did. And he wanted to help those who really needed it. Kids like him. People like him. And as much as heroes were cool and made great idols for a child, they were not helping anyone. In fact, they were harming them. Kids being encouraged to beat up their weaker or villainous classmates, countless homes being destroyed daily by heroes like Endeavor, and more recently, MT Lady, and the countless suicides committed by people who were not good enough to be a hero. Heroes made their own villains. And so here he was, light years away from the person he had been before Stain. Because All Might had saved him once, but Stain too had saved him. He didn't need saving again, because of Akaguro. Because of Stain. Because of a villain. He could save himself now. And he could save everyone else, maybe. And so here were the baby steps. He could use knives and he would continue to practice. But he would start learning new things. Swords, guns. He would be anything but a one-trick pony. He would be anything but weak. He would save everyone. Because he was Dekairu. Akaguro had told him that, and he would allow himself to become that person. Believe in himself. And he would not simply stoop so low as to kill or be killed. He wasn't a survivor. He was Midoriya Izuku. He thrived. He hoped. But hope wasn't just some weak thing. She wasn't just ephemeral, made up of spiderwebs and whispers. In reality, her face is dirted, her hands are red with blood, and she just spit out a tooth, clambering back up to her feet as she readies herself for another go. And Izuku had nothing if not hope. All Might knew nothing. Dreams can become reality. Just because they seem impossible doesn't mean they are. Even pigs fly if thrown hard enough. And that's why he was here. He would become a hero in the way that was real. Not just so he could prove a point. Sure, he now had spite on his side, and soon he would have bullets too, but he was going to help. Really help. And so he would work harder. Learn faster. For the future. Kaizome was lurking in a shady bar waiting for the information broker he had contacted, nursing a drink. He pretended to take small sips, but in reality he wasn't drinking anything. He had seen a lot as a vigilante, and as such alcohol had stopped appealing to him ages ago. He was here because he wanted to know why Izuku had been attacked. Things like that weren't to be taken lightly, considering Izuku's connections. Notably, himself. It was also important, because if this person was a part of a Yakuza group or any other organization for that matter, there could be more coming for him, revenge and all that. Petty crimes like that seriously irked him. Where is the drive? The creativity? Kaizome had made sure he was armed and disguised, because although he had heard about how trustworthy this informant was, he couldn't be sure. His time as a vigilante had set off enough people in the underworld. He had a lot of enemies, and he wasn't in the mood to be murdered by someone angry at him for some reason or another right now. He was in the middle of an existential crisis. He wanted to be alive when he figured out what made a hero good or not, and for that he had to not be killed. Observing his surroundings, he kept an eye out for both threats and the person he was here to meet. The person he was looking for had a pretty distinct appearance, and as such, Kaizome could figure out pretty quickly that he wasn't here yet. He waited for another few minutes, keeping an eye out. A figure dressed in all black, the outfit obviously designed to cover as much skin as possible, came in the back door. The prominent purple burn scars still stuck out of the sleeve though. Just who he was waiting for. His eyes followed the figure as they stalked towards him, one hand in their pocket, the other at the ready. Emitter type, based in the hands? Probably fire-based, if the burns were any indication. Thank the gods above for Izuku's contagious habits. Actually no. He'd thank Izuku. The man known as Dabi sat down opposite him, the shitty chair letting out a soft groan in protest to the force. What do you need? Dabi's voice was rough, for lack of a better described. It was obvious he probably either smoked or had been smoked, if the rest of his body was any indication. Dabi. Kaizome refused the urge to roll his eyes as he greeted the informant. A get-to-the-point kind of guy. He could respect it if it was kind of rude. Stain. What do you need? Dabi repeated, voice harsher than before, as the man got comfortable in his seat, grabbing the shitty beer that Kaizome had ordered for him. I need help finding out what connections this person has. I'll pay you a little upfront, and the rest when you get me the information I need. Kaizome said, showing the broker a shitty image of the corpse that he knew had haunted Izuku's dreams for days now. It was a photo that obviously highlighted the deader aspects to the body, but enough features were visible for identification. Dabi looked at it for a moment, sipping his beer. From the top of my head, that is a hitman for hire based in a minor Yakuza group. I can find out further connections, and maybe who hired them, in their last moments, so to speak. Give me 2 weeks and 8 yen, 600 more, and I'll give you a picture and general location of who hired them, as well as any other information I can dig up. This is why Kaizome chose Dabi over all the other FNG informants. The man is simply everywhere, and knows everything. He's a demon hard man to find. Deal. You get that photo and location, and I get you your money. Kaizome said, standing up. Enjoy the beer, was all he said as they parted ways. Dabi had been curious when Stain, the motherfucking hero killer, had requested a meeting with him. It wasn't the most convenient time for him, but when Stain requests a meeting, you better go, motherfucker, if only to fulfill your curiosity. His curiosity was only fueled when Stain showed him a picture of a, very obviously dead, Yakuza hitman, hitwoman? Hit person, by the name of Magpie. The Yakuza they worked with was small, and they weren't all that high up in the rankings within the group. Magpie was in it for the money, and the get-out-of-jail-free card that came with a group working for a higher-up in the Hero Commission. They were skilled, he would give them that, and had made a small name for themselves. But they also were an absolute quirkist cocksucking shithead where that deserved whatever they got. They had a habit of taking particular pride in killing their mutant and quirkless victims, often stalking them for weeks beforehand. Their quirk was an emitter type, allowing them to create an illusion that masks their identity, mimicking someone they have had a conversation. The actual requirements of a conversation were unclear, with before. He made sure to add all of that to the manila folder he was going to give Stain. During the last couple of days, Dabi had been snooping around, using his contacts to get a basic story on Magpie's whereabouts. He knew that it was highly likely that their dead body was in a ditch somewhere, but he wanted to see if other people knew that. Specifically, the Yakuza circle they belonged to knew. With commission contacts, their death was going to cause backlash for whoever killed them. And once he figured out that the police force had the murder on file, he also understood that Stain wasn't the perpetrator. The cause of death was a stab wound to the shoulder, but looking at the actual injury, it wasn't clean enough to be entirely deliberate or Stain's work. But that's relatively good, because of the murder being on file, the Hero Commission leader of their shitty organization had accessed that and found out about Magpie's death. And they weren't happy at all. He knew that Jiren, a fellow informant, had been hired to find out about who the killer was. But because he had hired Jiren first, he now had a lead on who had requested Magpie's services. And it was the head of the organization they were affiliated with. They had been hired to kill some quirkless kid who lived in Mustafu. And now that he had all of that information, the reason Stain wanted the last employer of Magpie's services, when on the surface, it had nothing to do with him, made him so curious. He wanted to know why. His plans for Endeavor can wait for this. The BSTRD won't be ungrateful for surviving another few weeks, he's sure. Izuku had managed to make himself a gun and muck around with the 1AK. No, Kaizome, the man was doing too much for him to call him by his surname, by now, had found on the person he killed's body. The gun was Jack's hit, and obviously purely for aesthetic purposes once you knew what you had to look for, but it made a good basic reference, and he was able to use a few of the parts. Once he had constructed the gun, and wrangled some of the right type of bullets from Dagoba, he had started to teach himself to shoot. He isn't any good at it as of yet, to be expected, and Kaizome had never had experience with guns at all, so he was mostly on his own. But he wasn't complaining. Guns weren't really ever commonplace in Japan, and it's no different now, so just having this trick up his sleeve will be great. And the more he practices, the better he will get. Izuku had also been wandering around Mustafu at night, essentially just curious. He was witness to quite a lot of drag deals, surprisingly. The crime rates were supposed to be super low around Mustafu, due to the heightened hero presence around UA. But he supposed, night was when civilians and reporters slept. Heroes weren't patrolling at night, Because what reason was there to when they couldn't receive praise from it? A lesson that had slowly taught to him through his experiences with Kaizome, and now his exploring of the area around him. Maybe the reason for the crime rate being considered so low was because arrests for crimes such as these weren't happening, and because no data was being recorded from villain captures. There isn't any evidence that the crime rate is in reality very high around here. Not even underground heroes patrolled around Mustafu very often. They were mainly focused on places with higher rates of violent crimes. It's funny how anything that doesn't involve violence and the ability to beat someone up gets forgotten. And Izuku would be lying if he said that realizing that didn't hurt his inner child. As a kid, he had grasped so hard onto the idea that heroes were something he should worship like they were gods. Heroes are not gods. They are human. And that is why things need to change. And not the kind of change that led to the same mistakes being made later. Even if you patch up the holes in your wall and cover up the cracks, what's to say it won't happen again, that eventually the cracks and holes that you hide won't eventually lead to the walls crashing down? The change that everyone needs means knocking down the walls and rebuilding them stronger. The walls might still fall one day, but with a stronger foundation, you are a lot safer. And hell if he knew how to do that. All he FNG knew was that it had to be done. He was one quirkless kid who 5 months ago knew nothing about fighting other than how to survive. So, he was starting small. A few blades, a gun and a newfound will to live. What better a foundation than that? And he also had Kaizome, someone that seemed to care for him more than anyone else had ever cared. The man seemed to also be the reason he had his foundations. But, maybe one day, Izuku would be able to help make a change. And maybe if the Izuku a year ago, or even 6 months ago, had realized all of these things, he would just be content sitting in his uselessness and waiting for others to do the dirty work for him. A stupid Deku can't change anything. And so he continued practicing. The more he practiced, the better he would get. And then he wouldn't be Deku. He'd be Dikairu. Matsubara Tetsuo was a simple man, if he said so himself. Maybe if you asked someone else, though, they would say something wildly different. After all, most people would not think that a simple man could become head of the Youth Militarized Hero Project. A high-ranking hero commission job such as that couldn't possibly be achieved by a man with no special qualities, or a particularly special quirk. Being able to make plants grow faster was not something that anyone would expect a hero commission higher-up to have. Especially when they are in charge of training their best and brightest. But, no matter. He was here now. As a relatively simple man, his goal in life was simple too. He just wanted to live comfortably. And to do that, those with quirks that are unpleasant or those without quirks can't remain. Unpleasant quirked situations and comfort are just two things that can't coexist. And as a starting point there was his mistress. Or, ex-mistress now, he supposed. It had been a couple of years since they had broken up, but they were still occasionally in contact. Their affair had lasted a while, and the only reason they couldn't remain together was because of her son. Quirkless, useless as a byproduct of his disability. But, still, somehow, that kid's wimpiness never ceased to amaze him. He wanted to become a hero, disregarding the fact that he was just barely human. And anyhow, there were laws against that kind of thing too. The child had recently been spotted mucking around Mustafu recently, too close to his side gig's base of operations after dark, and it had reminded Tetsuo that the boy needed to go. His mother, too, needed reminding that he wasn't far away. So, he had sent his best and brightest after the kid. Quick and easy. Not a notable death in the slightest. That was the plan, anyway. Somehow, Magpie ended up dead instead, and Midoriya Izuku was still up and kicking. He couldn't live comfortably like this. He was a simple man, and so he knew exactly what this feeling was. Bloodlust. Izuku had started building up a routine lately. Get up, go for a run, workout, and then eat breakfast. Practice shooting alone, and then sparring with Kaizome. Explore Mustafu until the early hours of the morning. Go to sleep, and hope the nightmares don't come to haunt him. Repeat. It kept his mind occupied, so he wasn't left to his thoughts alone. It was working and the nightmares were getting better. But even if he somehow managed to end up overthinking, he could just count to 1, that had been working lately. It was the time of day where he would normally be sparring, but Kaizome was out, apparently to go talk to some informant. And as such, Izuku was bored. He was at 875, and still he was very, very bored. He was tired too, but a nap was out of the question. Nightmares were not preferable to boredom. And even though he could train by himself instead, he understood what Kaizome had said about overworking himself, and as much as he wanted to, he knew that if he did, that he would probably collapse from exhaustion. He also was an absolute sucker for disappointed looks. And Kaizome was absolutely the king of them. Sighing, he started to fiddle around with a knife that Kaizome had gifted him a couple days prior. It was a simple throwing knife, nothing particularly special, other than you could make it glow different colors around the handle. But it was something someone else had given him. Free will and everything. But he had really been lacking in the basic human decency department. If he wasn't currently bunking with a serial killer, he would probably go to therapy. Clearing up the couch, he lay down, a wave of tiredness hitting him in a way that seemed comparable to a bus and a train decided to hit him from both directions at the same time. He really wasn't getting enough sleep. Maybe a nap was preferable to boredom? Just a small one. Not long enough to dream or anything. 5 minutes. For once, he dreamt of glowy knives and kind adults, and not blood. Dabi had probably spent a little too much time on this job. And as such, he had a little too much information and too little sleep. Not an entirely new feeling per se, but not exactly a pleasant one. Magpie was really shit at covering their trails. And so, he had a whole ton to follow. He only traced the most recent encounters, trying to figure out who exactly had hired them most recently. Magpie technically works for a small-time Yakuza group run by a commissioned shithead. But they do business for anyone who pays. He knew who Magpie was aiming for and who paid them. At face value, that was all he needed. But he isn't some meathead that half-buttes things. He wanted to know. But it was pretty obvious that this group was essentially some discriminatory group that hid under the cover of a Yakuza. They killed people that were classified under the term unfortunate quirked situations. It isn't a medical term exactly, but it was a term brought up by activists that has eventually come to bite them in the butt. It means those with villainous quirks, mutations, or those with nothing. He's been targeted himself because of his scarring being mistaken for a mutation of some kind, and his quirk was rather unfortunate as well, he supposed. But the thing is, he still couldn't figure out why a commission higher-up wants some random teenager dead. Sure, the kid was quirkless, but with how entirely average everything about that boy was, he had no idea why someone in the commission would want to kill some random quirkless kid, other than some obscure personal reason. So, he had set out on a virtual search that took days just to see if there was any connection to the kid and the official. And after a while he found it. Kobayashi Inko, also known as Midoriya Inko, mother of Midoriya Izuku. Matsubara Tetsuo, the hero commission lackey Yakuza shithead, had contacted her over a social network that he had found pretty easy access to. From their message history, it was clear that they had some kind of relationship, probably SXL. The shitter had a wife and children, and the mother had at least 2 other partners at the time, as well as an absentee husband. The two had broken up a couple of years back, but continued messaging, and the quirkless son had been mentioned a couple of times, mostly in a negative light. So, there was the motive. Finally, the salty ex-boyfriend wants to kill ex-girlfriend's son as payback, and the fact that the son was quirkless probably led to the fantasy being carried out, because in the cockhead's eyes, it was probably justified. He printed out all of the information he could at Jiren's base of operations, filing the new pieces of paper into the folder he had ready for Stain. He had definitely gone over his pay grade, but sue him. He's curious and he'll admit it, he's also a huge fanboy of Stain's. Not that he'll ever tell anyone that. Ever. Kaizome had been procrastinating even thinking about what his agreement with Dabi was about. And yes, repressing things never helps, it never has, but it was better to just throw himself into researching heroes and training with Izuku. But he was getting the information he wanted today, so he had to bring it to the forefront of his mind. And, as much as he was worried about Izuku's eat-sleep-repeat dissociative mentality, he was more worried about getting closure for both of them right now. So here he was, hanging around in some back alley behind a pub that was littered in cigarette bums and old bloodstains, waiting for someone who could burn him to a crisp in seconds. Such is life, he supposed. The man walked in a different getup this time. He was wearing an unzipped black hoodie, rolled up to the elbows, a white shirt, and some ripped jeans. Even with this small glance at Dobby's skin, you could see the extent of the scarring. But Kaizome was more interested in the crimson folder in his hand than anything else. Dobby handed it to him silently, and Kaizome passed over the money that he owed. Flicking through the folder, he noticed that there was a lot here. A lot. Much more than what he expected, and well above what was required with the amount that he was paying. I'm not being expected to pay more for this, am I? Kaizome narrowed his eyes. Dobby let out a scoff. No. I have a habit of insatiable curiosity, and this was so interesting I couldn't resist, I suppose. Contact me again. The man stalked off, waving a hand in what seemed to be half goodbye, half dismissal as he left. Kaizome was surprised, to say the least. Dobby didn't seem to be a man of goodwill such as that, and with even a basic skim, Kaizome could tell that this information was going to be interesting. He would be more curious about the quality of the information if it wasn't widely known that Dobby knew the happenings in the underground like the back of his hand. And being the former protege of Jiren, Dobby had all the credibility he needed. As he returned to his apartment, and therefore Izuku, he wondered if introducing Izuku to Dobby would be a good idea. Izuku had big ideas and even bigger goals, so getting him in contact with someone not only powerful in connections, but both intellectually and physically as well had its bonuses. He didn't suppose it was a bad idea. Maybe one day, it might help break the cycle of misery that was Izuku's mind right now. Hopefully Dobby would be willing to cooperate. Not too far away from where two men were exchanging information, another was building an army. Shigaraki Tamura knew that he couldn't beat All Might the first time around, but taking one step forward was always better than doing nothing. And just maybe he would get lucky. He sat on the edge of the roof, watching the street. He watched how people barely noticed him, despite his place dangling off of the edge of the house. They were all too worried about their own lives, he supposed. And with the sky darkening, and the house being barely noticeable, gray and squished between two grand skyscrapers, he didn't expect any of them to look up and see him. He saw them though. He saw the person with midnight blue hair. He saw the boy with crimson eyes. He saw the woman with hair quite similar to his own. He saw everyone who passed him by. It felt kind of like déjà vu. He awoke to the sound of Kaizome entering the apartment. He felt a lot better rested than he had in weeks. He had still dreamt, but the details were fuzzy, and he wasn't experiencing the normal constricting pain in his chest that he felt after a nightmare. He had fallen asleep in a rather uncomfortable position though. He was leant back, sitting up against the side of the couch. His poor neck. He looked up at Kaizome, who had just walked in from wherever he had been. He was looking at Izuku quizzically, and Izuku supposed it was fair. He was sitting in an uncomfortable position, obviously still half asleep, so much for a nap. And he was fairly sure there was a knife stuck in a wall somewhere as a result of his earlier boredom. He had learned early on that knives could be fun. At first he had been slightly disturbed by that fact, but he pretty much accepted it at this point. They were fun to muck around with, and that was the reality. He was a teenager, for God's sake, mucking around with dangerous items was practically his job. Now that Kaizome was home, he could go out and explore. He lifted himself up, groaning. I'm going out, call me if you need me, he sighed. Kaizome waved him off, before slouching and walking off towards his room, not saying a word. The dark bags under his eyes and the general ratty state of his long hair said everything it needed to. Izuku shoved on a hoodie that was lying around in the lounge room, not caring about who it belonged to. When he was finally out of the apartment, he allowed himself to take a moment to enjoy the fresh air. Even though he couldn't see the stars, the air was enough. It helped when he felt like he was trapped again. Something he had learned from Kaizome was that if he wanted to be free, he had to let himself out of the cage and not wait for someone to do it for him. He had been training a lot lately, but he still kind of felt weak. But when he was out here, exploring, he felt anything but weak. He started out where he usually did, behind the cafe that was definitely hiding some sort of drag ring, But the coffee was super great, so he didn't investigate further. He usually just watched the customers, all ranging from underground police officers, they weren't as subtle as they thought they were, to people who looked like their will to live decided to bail out 10 years ago. And a weird hobo guy that was probably a hero. Can't forget that one. Watching people was fun. This was the only cafe open past 3 in the afternoon, so he spent quite a lot of time here. He was also pretty sure the sketchier-looking customers had decided he was a stray kid who stayed around looking for free food. They all gave him that, "I understand you and I'm going to take you home and adopt you" look. He had gotten that look a few times from babysitters when he was younger. He supposed he looked the part, though, so he couldn't blame them. His hair had grown a bit, and he usually pulled it up in some sort of half-butted ponytail to keep from obstructing his vision. He was also wearing a shitty pre-cork band hoodie that was just slightly too big for him, with baggy ripped jeans. They weren't ripped in the stylish way. They were ripped in the exploded by childhood friend way. He was wearing his old red Converse, too. In every single way, he looked like a stray child hanging around for free food. Little did they know Kaizome wouldn't let him leave the apartment without a minimum of 3 weapons on him. He waited around as the cafe closed. The hobo guy hadn't come today, and he wanted to see if he would show up. Also, he had nothing better to do. Once the night sky was well and truly black, he started twisting and turning through the shadowy roads of Mustafu. And goddamn, Mustafu was riddled with crime. Small little crimes, mainly. Things like purse snatchers and people doing illegal trades. There was this one group of women that trade each other highly illegal weapons for self-defense. Girl power. And Izuku knew that treating life like some sort of game was probably tempting fate in some sort of way, and also highly unhealthy, but he was kind of lost. He knew he was getting somewhere with figuring out what would actually help fix all of this shit the Hero Commission had going on, and he often had episodes when he knew that he had to work harder so he could do something. But now, he was just drifting. Hours passed, and lately there had been less and less criminals, and just people in general hanging around, so he had a relatively uninterrupted night, where he didn't have to dodge fights behind bars and shady-looking meetings. He was about to head back when he literally stumbled, yes he may have tripped, but that is besides the point, into something he definitely should not have. A sidekick associated with the agency Ida 10 was standing over a small man. Why was she even in Mustafu? She wasn't supposed to be in Mustafu. The sidekick's name was Feather, and was popular enough among the populace that they were close to becoming a ranking hero. Her large, white and blue speckled wings were just barely spread, and with the way she was standing, it looked like a predator ready to eat its prey. He knew what was happening here. He had seen it happen before. He wanted to back away, but he was stuck in place. That time, he had thrown a rock at the aggressor's head. That time, it was just some common thug using their quirk to overpower someone. That time was the only time he had ever interfered with the nightlife of Mustafu. That time, it had been easy. This time, it was a hero. He knew that Feather wasn't going to simply freeze and stop the moment Izuku did. And yet here he was, stuck in place again. He knew that heroes were becoming worse and worse, he knew that. But knowing things is different to seeing them for yourself. He was staring at the scene through the curls of his hair that didn't go back into his ponytail as he leant against the wall. Nothing too bad had happened yet, but Feather wasn't planning to stop and leave anytime soon. Their victim was so out of it that they couldn't fight back either. And it really wasn't his business what was happening. He avoided everything else that happened while he was out here. He wasn't a hero as much as he had wanted to be as a kid, as much as it would be fulfilling to do so. The anger came to him slowly, filling in a gap in his chest he didn't know he had had before, if he could even call it anger, that is. He hated how this hero was taking advantage of someone weaker. Objectively, any hero was stronger than any normal civilian, both in media presence and in strength. But in a state like this the man had no chance. But Izuku did. And his body moved on its own. Feather was dead. Her real name was Kamasaki Sora. She was an arguably good sidekick, and a strong one too. She had a family, and she loved everything and everyone, maybe a little too much. People loved her, and now she was dead. The public didn't know yet. It was because no one knew who did it. Not the heroes, not the police, Not even Fang Nizu had any idea. Tensei sighed, placing his head in his hands. The police were worried that it would happen again. He had been told that a similar murder had happened just weeks ago. And the worst thing was there was a witness. But the witness was too sloshed to be considered credible, and the description of the assailant was generic, at best. Blackish hair, toxic green eyes. No height, no description of any clothes, nothing other than the eyes. Apparently, the eyes were the only thing that was memorable enough. But that wasn't even getting into what the witness Sama Hisao, his name was saying had happened leading up to the attack. Tensei wanted to say that he couldn't see Kamasaki doing anything of the sort, he really did want to. But he had seen how she looked at certain men, especially when she was in costume, patrolling around. When she was giving autographs, too. Like they were prey, and she was the predator. But the looks were always fleeting, and he always had written it off as some sort of instinct related to her quirk. He supposed maybe she just masked it before it could get too obvious. He had seen how long she had spent in that course on media appearances and hero personas. And he wanted to support Sama in his claims, but because of the man's drunken state, both of them were being ignored and written off. Damn it. He might as well go and help Tenya with his training. He wasn't getting anywhere, sulking like this. The UA entrance exam was coming up soon, and Toshinori was wondering what he would do, in terms of his successor. He needed to find one soon. One for all was becoming volatile and unpredictable, and he needed to lessen the strain on his body, before he eventually couldn't transform at all. Pushing his limit the day of the sludge villain had almost messed up his time limit again. But when that boy had faltered, it was only for a moment, just one little second, he moved. Not intentionally in any way, his body just went on autopilot, and then suddenly, that boy was safe. Bakugo Katsuki, he had a strong quirk, and was trying out for UA. In fact, the forms of students applying to the hero course was where Toshinori had recognized him. Young Bakugo was definitely an option. He had a heroic fighting spirit, and during the attack he had never given up. He would have kept fighting to the bitter end. And that was exactly what One for All needed. Deku was gone, and Katsuki doubted he was coming back. My fault. He was no longer in his way. Good riddance. Achiko wasn't going to lie. She had ignored training during her final year of junior high. She had gone on runs every day and been to the gym 3 times a week, but she hadn't really trained. But once she saw the villain attack that All Might had to come resolve on the news, the one where the villain had trapped someone her age and almost won, because the heroes on site couldn't do anything, she realized she had to try, so that if she was one of the heroes on the scene on an attack like that, she wanted to be able to do something. So she decided to work hard, signing up for mixed martial arts lessons. She attended the cheapest one in her area, and had classes with other people her age. It was a pretty popular age to train in combat, what with hero courses opening their doors to hero hopefuls soon, so there was a class exclusively for teenagers. Most people in her class were also training to be heroes, but there were a couple that had just done this from a young age for sport, or those who just wanted to be able to defend themselves. But there also was this boy. Their sensei had called him Midoriya a couple of times, she thought. He had wild green curls that he pulled back into a small and messy ponytail, and toxic green eyes that glowed with intelligence. He had started a couple of weeks after her, and at first was skittish and wary of everyone, mainly focusing on his own training and avoiding others, but after a while he started to grow into himself and occasionally conversed with others. At the time, she didn't have any friends in the class either, and was also kind of impressed with the rate he was improving at, and also the level of grace he performed everything with, and had decided to talk with him. Hi. I'm Uraraka Achiko. Nice to meet you, she smiled brightly. Something in him compelled her to just smile as wide as she could around him. Maybe it was his quirk. No. Surely he had some sort of agility quirk. The boy looked shocked, then wary. Nice to meet you too, he nodded, continuing his cool-down stretches. She joined him, doing her own version of the routine. You are really good at this. I'm kind of jealous, it doesn't come as naturally to me, but if I want to be a hero, I have to try hard, right? She ignored the fact he didn't introduce himself. It was slightly rude, but he didn't seem to have any malintent. He looked up at her, staring at her for a moment, and then went back to what he was doing. I guess. I'm not going to be a pro hero, though, I don't think. But I understand the need to try your hardest. Also, thank you for your kindness. And even though he said it to the floor rather than to her, she understood that he really was grateful and meant what he said. They didn't say anything more after that. What had surprised her was the fact that he said that he didn't want to be a hero. With the way he seemed so dedicated with every moment, every word, every glance around the room, she had simply assumed that he wanted to be a hero too. But she had always been taught that assumptions were not to be relied upon, even if she couldn't help them sometimes, and she wasn't going to judge Midoriya for it. She did, however, use him as someone to look up to. He was always improving, working to become better, and she made sure to work just as hard. Even when the other girls at school made comments about her gain of muscle mass, or when she was frustrated she couldn't get something right, she made sure to look at him and his progress and move to become just as good as him. One day he didn't show up for training though, and she felt like there was something missing. She supposed there was him being someone that most people in the class looked on as motivation, but she made sure not to falter, because things like this were bound to happen in the hero world. People left and people moved on. And she hadn't even known Midoriya, so she shouldn't feel like she had missed out on something. But, despite that, she wouldn't forget him. Tenya was slightly worried about his brother, who was running around like a headless chicken trying to balance PR and his help with the case on Feather. He seemed a lot more stressed lately, but he supposed it was warranted, given an esteemed sidekick of his had been found dead. Well, esteemed certainly wasn't a word he'd use anymore, if she was alive, but it was rude to speak ill of the dead, even if they deserved it. But, somehow, Tensei still made time to help Tenya. His older brother said that it helped him escape the chaos of his hero life, and Tenya was going to be a hero, so he was happy to help. He worked twice as hard as he was originally planning to, because now that one of the strongest heroes he had seen working alongside his brother had been killed by some degenerate, he knew that heroes were not immortal, and he understood that slacking off was not to be accepted when he had a family legacy such as his own to uphold. So he trained his quirk and his combat. He worked on his strength and took breaks when he was tired. He learned the art of meditating, as one of his tutors suggested it to help calm his thoughts. He believed it worked, at least a little bit. He couldn't help but worry for his brother, though. So, he invited Tensei to more of his training lessons, helped where he could in the agency, and tried to provide a solid presence for his brother to rely upon. After all, he was going to be a hero. Shoto was on the edge of extreme exhaustion and insanity. The exhaustion was mainly due to his old man's training, what with the UA entrance exams on the horizon. The insanity, however, was mainly due to the feeling of being watched that had been following him around for the last few days. It set him on edge, and that wasn't a good idea, especially when getting harassed by his father was in the mixer as well. He was almost inclined to rip his SPRM donor's face off during training today. The only reason his father's gory demise never came to fruition was Shoto's intense desire to PSS him off by becoming a hero his father couldn't claim his own, and he couldn't really prove his father wrong if he was dead and faceless, could he? And yes, sure, he was having strangely violent thoughts lately, but he had come here, to the shopping center, to blow off steam by spending a little money. Not his own money, of course, and there was also the absolutely not his father had given him when he had asked to leave the house too, but he couldn't muster up the ability to care, even though he was aware of the consequences that would surely peek their ugly faces the next day. He had collected a fair bit of cheap All Might merchandise that he would hide around the house so far. The best part was that he had enough that if he planned out the placing well, his father would be finding All Might stickers and keychains around the house for weeks. He had also bought a portable lock for his door from a pop-up store, and was suitably satisfied that his father wouldn't be able to barge into his private space at any time anymore. When he was in the hero store, he had stopped in front of the Endeavor section, briefly considered buying one to deface and gift to Natsuo, but he didn't want to add to the BSTRD's popularity statistics. He did buy a pack of Hawk stickers, though. The younger hero could use the support. He was cool. He had also visited the food court to get some food he wouldn't usually be allowed to get. It was bad quality, but he could already feel the craving to get more. He now understood what Natsuo meant when he said that he was missing out. He really had been. Having been a while since he had last left the house on his own terms, he basked in the freedom. It was nice to be able to relax his face from the expression he carefully wore around the house. He felt lighter, if that was possible. He was somewhat grateful for the case his father was working on, because otherwise he wouldn't have been able to leave the house undetected. Shoto knew he shouldn't be thinking of it like this, considering someone was dead, a hero in fact, but he was free, and he couldn't really say he knew who she was. He supposed he could say he was grateful for her sacrifice, as dark as it sounded. He knew nothing of the case, other than its existence, and the fact it was his salvation today, but he hoped despite his previous statements, that she rested peacefully. Naomasa hasn't had more than 7 hours in 3 days. He had even started tolerating the coffee in the station too. The world was ending and it wasn't even all for one's fault this time. Probably. They had no leads on the feather case. All they knew was her death was quick and brutal. 2 stab wounds in the side, death by exsanguination. She was left at the place of death, and the murder weapon was obviously a professional blade due to the clean wounds. A few defensive wounds, and it's possible that the perpetrator will have some wounds of their own, but nothing severe. The killer made an effort to clear the site of DNA evidence, but due to the complexity of the situation it was probable that it was not premeditated. The wounds were similar to a case he had found on his desk not that long ago. One that was still on his desk, in fact. A Jane Doe in terms of their birth name, but after investigation they were found to be known as Magpie, a well-known hitman in the underground, found dead in a bag of hair. What concerned him was the connection. There was a killer out there that was able to defeat 2 people that specialized in combat. It was possible they saw themselves as some sort of vigilante, and that was dangerous. When someone saw themselves as a hero, they often were not easy to beat, but finding them was a different story. Often, they reveal themselves in one way or another, trying to claim responsibility for their deeds, or use themselves as a symbol. In short, their ego usually gets the better of them, but not before they do some damage. And with the next generation of heroes already preparing for the next step in their lives, it was crucial that they found this person before something happened that endangered them. Now, more than ever, what with All Might's precarious state, they needed heroes. Izuku staggered back home at an ungodly hour, disoriented, and a while later than he would usually get back, with his clothes and hands bloody, leaving a crimson handprint on the door handle. He was shaking a little from the remaining adrenaline that was circulating in his body. He had spent a while in a daze making sure that the hero's death couldn't be connected to him, and had also hung out around the back of the apartment building, trying to figure out how to get in without wasting all of the effort he had just put in trying to not get tied back to the crime. In the end, he just resigned himself to using the fire escape, the entrance being at the side of the building and the alarms and cameras having been shut off years ago. Luckily, Kizome's apartment was only 2 doors down from where the fire escape opened to. He figured that Kizome was probably in the living room, either sharpening his blades or doing research on heroes, so he probably had a lot of explaining to do surrounding the blood on his shirt and under his fingernails. The fact that he was acting like a teenager who had simply snuck out to see friends or something surfaced in his mind, and he let out a soft laugh at the irony. He opened the door to the apartment, slowly, hoping that maybe Kizome had realized that he was human, and therefore needed to sleep at least once every 3 days, so that maybe Izuku could explain on his own terms, and not when he frankly felt like shit and was working out what the hell had happened himself. Kizome had not yet had that epiphany, though, and Izuku had to face him as soon as he walked in. Izuku tried to look as not guilty as possible. He failed miserably because he was very much in a state of shock and jitters, and could barely stop himself from curling up in a ball and escaping the world for a while. It took Kizome a second to process the scene, but once he realized, he rushed away from the papers strewn about on the coffee table and practically leapt at Izuku, looking a mix of sad, confused and worried. How he managed it, Izuku didn't know. It seemed to be a Kizome-specific trait. The hell happened to Izuku? Kizome whisper yelled, shaking Izuku's shoulders. Unlike most apartments these days, the walls in this apartment aren't cork-proof, so their neighbors would hear the older man if he said anything too loudly. Izuku just let himself be shaken, barely keeping himself from collapsing from subsequent terror and exhaustion as is. He really wanted to sleep, and maybe shower too. This conversation was not going to happen right now, and as much as he was aware of the fact people generally didn't like it when he walked away from them without explanation, Izuku needed more than 3 hours of sleep tonight, nightmares be dead. He reluctantly pulled himself away from the hands keeping him standing and staggered towards the bathroom, not bothering to hide his limp. He would check out his injuries in the shower. Kaizome had been in the middle of planning a murder when Izuku had practically fallen into the apartment. Forgetting the papers strewn about the coffee table? Yes, it was a wooden board held up by 2 milk crates. Yes, it was a coffee table. The crates also held some of Izuku's weapons inside them, so it was actually very useful. He rushed forward, planning to interrogate Izuku about the blood on his shirt and hands that he had most definitely not missed, despite what Izuku obviously hoped, if the look on his face was any indication. All of his emotions and thoughts were warring against each other, confusion, anger, worry and pride fighting tooth and nail against one another. He wasn't sure where exactly pride came from, but it was there nonetheless. He simply watched as Izuku limped off to the bathroom, and understanding that he wouldn't get any answers from standing around like an idiot, so he continued trying to figure out the utter bullshit that was Matsubara Tetsuo. He had gotten drabbles of information about the man from different sources, and from what he could tell the man had a pretty shitty reputation. Not enough to get people to go out of their way to kill him, but given that a lot of villains and vigilantes had quirks that weren't flashy or clean, as some put it, and the man was the walking, talking definition of quirkist, he was someone pretty easy to get information on. People weren't too keen on hiding information about someone they wanted dead anyway. His reputation even caused someone to give the information for free, as long as he promised to give the man a taste of his own medicine. Matsubara wasn't a mystery in any form, but he was someone that held far too much power. He was a commission rat, one he had actually looked into in the past due to his Yakuza connections. The man was cautious though, with many identities and secrets, and even though many people knew different pieces of information about him, he didn't leave enough to connect the pieces. Matsubara wasn't exactly a mystery, but he was someone who held far too much power. He had many identities and secrets, so even though many people knew different pieces of information about him, they didn't help to connect the dots, due to the way Matsubara scattered the information that people knew about him. Kaizome had to make a lot of logic leaps to get anywhere, but he had a basic overall picture, yet still something was missing. Why had the man sent someone after Izuku? It was a while before Izuku emerged from the shower, but at least he was clean and looking better than before, with bruises on his arms exposed by his short-sleeve top. The purple and yellow of the marks that were littered up and down his arms were a stark contrast to the pale skin of his arms. He was still limping but seemed more sure on his feet. His toxic green eyes seemed brighter now, and despite his limp and obvious exhaustion, he appeared lucid. But Kaizome knew that he wouldn't get answers just yet, and that he shouldn't push, despite wanting to. Izuku leaned into Kaizome's side to look at the papers. Once he saw one featuring Matsubara's picture, provided by Dabi, recognition flashed in his eyes. That was Inko's longest-lasting boyfriend, he said. They were on and off for years, but I haven't seen him in a while. He always looked at me weirdly too, but never said anything to me. Why are you looking at him? Kaizome considered for a moment, but quickly decided to avoid the topic of the incident. Izuku was clearly not in the state of mind for a reminder of that. He's a higher-up in the Hero Commission, and also the figurehead of a small-scale Yakuza group that operates mainly in hit-for-hire circles. They run mainly on favors, and use the favors as leverage to manipulate other groups. He pointed out certain sheets of paper as he spoke, pushing others towards Izuku to read. I thought you were after heroes? You stopped for a bit, but I guess you're planning to go after heroes that actually deserve it? Or people that deserve it, I guess. Izuku took a moment to read through a bit of information. He gave up, groaning, I'm too tired to think about this right now. Izuku lay his head on Kaizome's shoulder, reading, or at least trying to, the piece of paper he had in his hand. Before long Izuku's eyes were closed, though, and he could feel the breaths on his shoulder begin to slow down. He looked so peaceful when he slept. Hopefully he was too tired to have any bad dreams, despite the faint red lines under his fingernails and the bruises on his arms. That would ruin it. Kaizome wasn't exactly happy when he explained what had happened. He had already inferred the situation, what with the blood and all, but the fact it was a pro-hero he hadn't expected, apparently. There may have been a bit of whisper shouting, glaring, and everything in between. But when all was said and done, they both had spoken in soft tones about what had happened, and what they would do. All Izuku could think about was the fact that he had killed, that a pro-hero was dead because of him. Thankfully, though, his sleep the last couple of days had been void of any bad dreams, but during his waking hours all he could do was try to manage his warring emotions. He had been conflicted all week about everything. Before, all he had ever wanted was to be a hero. Things were cut and dry. Heroes, villains. Civilians. Now, a hero was dead because of him. And while he continued training, and subsequently getting facefuls of sand as he sparred with Kaizome on the beach, she couldn't. She couldn't become a ranking hero, or save someone anymore, or stop a villain. But he had saved someone. She had been hurting them, was going to hurt them more. A hero, someone who was supposed to be saving others from that exact situation, was doing the opposite. And he had saved someone. Battling with his constant guilt and worry was a constant stream of save it running through his thoughts. But in an attempt to lead the police to think that maybe it was Stain that killed the sidekick, another hero died in a similar fashion, but Kaizome made sure that the singular witness, another victim, why were heroes attacking people, was aware enough to know who it was, even announcing his presence and name to make sure. It was all over the news, with the death of Feather, previously unreported, had been thankfully credited to Stain. What mattered to the media, though particularly Stain's growing fanbase, was that Stain had returned and was showing the world why he needed to do this. The victims from both incidents had decided to speak up online, and it was circulating on social media. As good as it wasn't going to last. It wasn't lasting. Posts on social media even insinuating that heroes were bad or that anything needed changing were being deleted and taken down en masse. Stain had been officially upgraded to an S-class villain, after years of being unclassed and months of debate online and in the news, and now that he had been confirmed to continue operating, heroes were worried. The Hero Commission was worried about what Stain was stirring up, that much was clear. But that wasn't Izuku's problem. The past week, he had been messing around with coding and programming, trying to figure out how to hack, in a sense, and it was hard and annoying, but he had been a kid with no friends for years, so of course he had mucked around with technology a bit, so he had a little bit of understanding. He trained, with knives mainly, but he kept practicing with his homemade gun, and Kaizome was introducing him to the art of using a katana. He knew things were moving forward, but to him, it felt like everything was stuck in an infinite loop. Or maybe it was just him, standing still and watching in a world that was moving on without him. But if Izuku was good at anything, it was watching. He liked it too. Imagining living someone else's life. Maybe that lady on the street was going home to a partner and 2 children. Maybe that man begging on the street had a home and food and a life. Maybe he was an actor, or someone who didn't really need the money, or maybe they were simply a beggar on the street. Watching others made him feel a little less broken, or distract himself from his brokenness anyway. It was as he was watching the world that Kaizome approached him, almost startling him off of the roof he was on. The man said nothing, but there was a glint of humor in his eye as he crouched next to Izuku. Maybe the media was right about Stain being a SDST. Come on. Let's get down from here. Bad memories and all that. Kaizome said carefully, shifting slightly as he adjusted his balance. I was actually kind of enjoying my time up here, thank you very much. He said, rolling his eyes. Despite his claims, he shuffled back from the edge and stood up, his head spinning from getting up too fast. Maybe it's my bad memories. Now, come on. Kaizome said, opening the fire escape door. His deadpan expectant look overriding his confusion on how he moved so fast towards the door without alerting Izuku. A secondary teleporting quirk? What were his parents' quirks? Maybe a mutation linked to stealth. Kaizome walked through the open door, his gait and attitude showing obvious impatience, despite his attempt to cover it up with humor. Getting up and following him, Izuku made it just before the heavy door slammed shut. The walk down the stairs was silent, save for their footsteps echoing around them, neither of them bothering to make their footsteps lighter. Their exhaustion was almost visible in the air, what with the lazy slump of Kaizome's shoulders, uncharacteristic in a way that Izuku understood all too well. He couldn't quite be bothered to hold himself high anymore either. Kaizome hadn't been very forthcoming of where they were headed, waving off his questions, both literally and with non-answers. It had Izuku on edge, but he wasn't sure whether he was not anxious anymore, so he wasn't sure if he was being led to his death by the one person he had managed to finally build a healthy relationship with, or he was just high-strung. The two of them stopped outside a small building. It wasn't special at all. In fact, it was probably built at the same time as the 7 other shops and other things in the area. It was the exact same as all the others, save for perhaps the low, lingering scent of cigarettes. Kaizome turned towards him and shoved his hood over his head semi-violently. Understanding what he was trying to say, while the older man worked on picking the lock, Izuku worked on tucking most of his curls back into his hood. It would probably be a good idea to dye it or something, but the main reason they hid it anyway was to stop anyone with a particularly dangerous grudge against Stain from attacking him on the street, if they ever recognized who was following the man around when he came with him to get knives and other things. But usually he was informed of what they were doing. Giving up on simply pushing his hair back, he lowered his hood and pushed most of his hair into a small bun at the back of his head. There were wisps of navy green hair still free at the back and on the sides, but it was as good as he would get. The hood went back up when the door opened. Stepping carefully into the shop, it looked like a shop. Despite its distinct lack of labeling Kaizome a pace ahead of him, Izuku immediately started looking around, trying to take stock of what was happening. There was a desk in the far corner, but it was empty. There were a couple of shoe boxes underneath, both having paper peeking out of the top. There was a counter in the middle of the room, presumably for what would have been a cash register, but instead it held an unhealthy amount of cigarette boxes. There were also some round glasses sitting on the table, next where a man with silver hair and purple dress pants was leaning. But that wasn't what instantly captured Izuku's attention. Leaning up against the wall, smoking a cigarette and typing furiously into a flip phone was someone he had spotted a few times on his nightly walks talking to people, behind a bar or a club. Sometimes, he handed folders to people. Once or twice it simply looked like he was talking to them. What made him so recognizable was his scars. They were a deep purple, and they seemed to be everywhere. His face, his arms. It looked like they reached down his shirt too. What had made Izuku so fascinated with the man to the point he had begun keeping an eye out for him, was that he recognized how the skin was marred and twisted. He himself had similar, if less intense, burns on his shoulder and chest. He supposed his strange fascination was perhaps due to the fact he longed for someone to share some sort of kinship with. The dim lighting, that was, according to Kaizome, designed by Yakuza in the early days of quirks to help shield people's identities and defining features that came with the rise of quirks, barely allowed him to see the scars, but he knew they were there. The metal staples lining the man's face were one indication of their presence. Izuku wondered how he got them. To have such widespread burns in such specific places? It was highly likely that his quirk of Fire One, he had seen it, once, when he lit a cigarette, was the cause. Izuku tore his eyes from the man, trying to focus on Kaizome, but he couldn't stop from looking out of the corner of his eye every now and then. Too many people expected too much from him, nowadays. He had 4 different people asking for the exact same thing in 4 different ways. But he was getting paid, so should he really be complaining? Dabi was trying as hard as he could not to melt the phone in his hands as he responded to a particularly FING dumb client. His contact name was aptly named Jack Sheet, Brain Cells. He found it a nice play on words, considering the fuckwad's name. Jiren had said that he was expecting someone, and even though he knew that he wasn't required to be here, or even supposed to be, he stayed. He was too lazy to leave, in all honesty. So, when 2 people walked in, he didn't even flinch. He just kept texting PP for Brains, who was refusing any of his suggested meeting places. He was engrossed in his text message fuckery, when a voice he recognized started speaking to Jiren. He couldn't quite place it, so he glanced to where Jiren was speaking with his client. Holy shit. It had been a small while since he had last seen the man, and even though he had no need for it and probably was being a little creepy, screw that though, he could do what he wanted. He kept looking at things related to what he had found back then, to alleviate his curiosity. And that brought him to the second figure in the room. He kept his main focus on the phone in front of him, but from the corner of his eye he could see him. That had to be Midoriya Izuku. It didn't matter that the bright green eyes staring him down were a lot more venomous than in any of the images he had seen, or that this kid was slightly taller than was last recorded on any medical file. This was him. The fact he was standing at Stain's side, merely weeks after having a hit put on him by a Yakuza shithead, was a miracle, considering what information Dabi had. A quirkless teenager, a nobody hero hopeful, like everyone else his age. And now the kid was staring into his soul with those FING toxic green eyes. Dabi wasn't a coward, but he made sure he didn't look back. The kid seemed like he could stare into your thoughts and dissect you piece by piece just with his eyes, and that made him very uncomfortable. Maybe he was a coward, but he sure didn't feel like one. This was very justified. But he did listen in. Stain was discussing blueprints for a gun. He just knew that the blueprints weren't for Stain. Didn't seem like his style. FING hell. Teenagers were going to take over the whole goddamn world at this point, weren't they? Maybe it would be a change for the better though. Who knows? Eventually the discussion spiraled into support items, also probably for the kid. He could almost sense Jiren's confusion when it came to the kid. Stain probably hadn't mentioned him, and those effing eyes. And the gun was probably a bit confusing for the man, too, considering Stain's trademark. Jiren wasn't an idiot. He probably figured out who the blueprints were for as well. There was definitely a slightly misshapen gun in the kid's pocket, now that he thought about it. Why give a child more than one gun? That's what it looked like Stain was planning to do, anyway. But Dabi looked Stain up and down. Actually, no one in this building should be talking shit about giving children weapons at the moment. In this room alone there were probably enough weapons to arm a small riot. Honestly, despite his earlier fear discomfort around the kid, he was getting more and more intrigued. He wondered if the kid had anything to do with the return of Stain to the public eye. It seemed to line up, in all honesty. So that settled it. Dabi seriously had to talk to this kid, his reputation as a cryptic D aside. FNG hell, curiosity killed the cat. But satisfaction brought it back, he reasoned with himself. Stain had returned to the public. All for one could remember when he was still Stendhal, mucking around where he didn't belong. In all honesty, the nuisance had a following that could potentially be helpful to his future plans with Tamura. That didn't change the fact he was a major reason that he had ended up in this chair anyway, tubes hanging from his face. His meddling alerted all might to his movements. But perhaps if he could make himself useful in the future it would settle some of the issues that he had caused. He would wait and see. Katsuki wasn't weak. Some extra had said that once, after Deku left, to taunt him. It was the one time he reined in his temper enough to wait until after school was over to beat him up. He had to keep his record clean, for UA, and he didn't always have the protection he did when it came to Deku. He knew that much. It was in everyone's eyes, too. The way those idiots looked at him like he was beneath them set him off to no end. He wasn't weak, though. The UA entrance exams were coming up, and he threw himself into his training. School was like a chore now. Nothing was different, and yet, he wasn't at school anymore, and for a moment he was free of terrified worried looks, and stupid muttering and hopeless dreams. But then Auntie Inko began coming over more often. He loved Auntie, but she was a constant reminder of something he'd rather forget. And he had asked once where he was, why he left. Did she know? Did he tell her? She had smiled and said that he was fine. His chest felt a lot lighter afterwards. He was safe. He didn't have to worry. He could be a hero that wins, everywhere that Deku lost. He was better than that. Sometimes he understood, though, the hunger, the absolute need to be a hero. What could he be if not that? Deku was gone, good riddance. That's what he should have thought, once, and then moved on. And yet, the idiot was still here, in his brain, making him feel weak and gross. Katsuki wasn't weak. Izuku played with a curl that was hanging out of his hood as he looked through the blueprints Kaizome had gotten him. Getting the materials would be a bit of a hassle, he noticed, and they were by no means instructions, but they would do fine. He was hanging out on the roof of his apartment for the second time that night, legs crossed as he leaned his back against the cement railing on the side. The sky was getting lighter by now, and knew that he probably should have slept when he came back to the apartment, Kaizome having slipped away on the way back, apologizing but saying he had set something up hero-killing wise, and that he needed to cement his place on the food chain in the career villain world, but he had felt watched and opted to go up here instead. Rooftops made him feel like the observer, rather than the observed, usually, but the feeling hadn't gone away. Izuku watched the fire escape door carefully. He had noticed the handle shift at one point, but the door never opened. He wondered if his stalker was also socially anxious. He supposed he would have to do it for them then. Getting up and stretching, he walked towards the door. Upon opening it, he discovers a man covered in scars, not an unfamiliar one either. He had seen him less than 2 hours ago. He wished he knew his name. The man is smoking a cigarette, looking down at a phone, a proper one this time, not the flip phone he was using earlier. His posture is relaxed, but one of his hands is free, which usually means that he feels threatened, from what Izuku can tell. He's never actually seen the man use his quirk in combat, or even more than a small flame on his fingertips, but considering the way his quirk works, it looks like a pyrokinesis quirk that produces blue flame. Having a hand free means that he can attack easily. Izuku wonders why his presence threatens this guy. If he stands like that to produce flame, it means that he can produce a lot of it, and it also means it burns hot, if he needs to angle his body away from the line of fire. The man's ice blue stare at him lazily from his spot on the wall. Neither of them speak. The one who breaks the silence is the man, his black, sharp hair shifting slightly as the cool wind from outside blows in from the open door. Name's Dabi. I know yours already, if it means anything to you. But I don't think you would introduce yourself as Midoriya to anyone like me. So the polite thing to do would be to tell me a name I can repeat. Dikairu. The word comes out of his mouth before he could even consider it. Maybe it's something he had subconsciously filed away for a situation like this. Whatever this situation even is. Dikairu, nice to meet you. The way Dabi says the name Izuku has already decided was his, makes it sound like he was taunting him. Izuku calls bullshit. It's a part of an act. Dabi is really just curious. I don't think this is the best place to have this conversation, HM? Let's step outside. I don't trust you. Izuku is telling the truth. He doesn't trust Dabi. Nevertheless, he steps back onto the concrete of the roof, holding the door open, gesturing for Dabi to move. Screw murderous-looking men that definitely are villains. He has a disorder called insatiable curiosity. Izuku really wanted to know why Dabi's quirk burned him. He didn't know for a fact that it was Dabi's quirk that burned him, but everything pointed to that as a possibility. Point is, Izuku wanted to know why. Not that he could just ask. Unfortunately. Do you know who Matsubara Tetsuo is? Dabi asks, taking a long drag of his cigarette. Izuku shook his head cautiously, tracking the man's movements with his eyes. The name rang a bell, but he didn't have an image in his head. Perhaps it was just a name he had heard in passing. The man lets out a small hum of acknowledgement. Well, he's the one that sent Magpie after ya. Stain asked me to find out why, and the only connection I could find was one Fukudashi Inko. That's to you though, as I understand it. What? Actual. One thing at a time, please. Matsubara Tetsuo. Nope, still can't figure it out. Maybe a employer of Inko's? Magpie? Sent after him? Izuku considered it for bit, watching Dabi's piercing blue eyes watch him. When it came to him, he nearly vomited. What was Inko's relationship with Matsubara? Izuku asked, and despite knowing that his eyes were blown wide and he probably looked vaguely sick, he needed to know. Mistress. But my real question is, Dikairu, why is Magpie dead? If Dabi was asking, then he already knew. I caught her off guard. From Dabi's reaction, that wasn't the answer he wanted. What he was really digging for, though, Izuku didn't know. He wondered if Dabi knew either. Crushing the cigarette but between his fingers, the man's icy blue eyes bore into him for a few painfully long seconds. Then he left, and just before he went through the door, he paused. We aren't done here yet. I'll see you again, kid. And then he was gone. The conversation went by in just a few minutes. But To Izuku, it meant the world. Kaizome was getting a stern talking to. Fing hell. Kaizome growled at his opponent, backing into the shadows of the alley he was in. The hero was tipsy, swaying just slightly as he walked, so he could hope to incapacitate him by catching him unawares. It didn't seem like he knew how Mustafu's dead-end backstreets as well as Stain did, so he could probably use that to his advantage. Oh come on, hero killer. Growling like a dog won't help you beat me. Death Arms bellowed, flexing his infamous biceps as he approached where Kaizome had been. Using the drunken hero's distraction, Kaizome managed to quietly slip between the wall and the empty dumpster, circling behind Death Arms while the hero monologues about something or other. Kaizome made a habit not to listen to drunks. They often had nothing good to say. Grateful that you lasted this long on the streets. No matter, I'll be the one to capture you. After that I'll rise through the ranks. As much as he could appreciate a monologue, it was times like this that he thanked his new quick and efficient style of going about things during a fight. Thanks to his time training and sparring Izuku, he had realized quite a few things. For one, Izuku's inexperience led to him taking any opportunity that he saw rather than having a set fighting style like many fully trained pros, or even just people who had fought for a while, trained or otherwise. That, paired with the teenager's undeniable enthusiasm and intellect, as well as his uncanny ability to spot a weakness, made him unpredictable, and trying to get a word in would just lead to an embarrassing defeat by the hands of an inexperienced teenager. Not good for his pride. Using the hero's wide celebratory gestures against him, arms forward, gesturing wildly, Kaizome brought his blade down on the false hero's back. The resulting sound filled an empty space in his soul. You've met your match as it. Despite not actually being able to see the hero's face, he could picture the BSTRD's smug smile falling as he registered the pain. Using the shock in his leverage on the hero's back, he pushed him down as he pulled out his knife, thoroughly enjoying the sound of a false hero in pain. Liking the knife, Kaizome considered his options. He could keep this hero alive. Death Arms would live to see another day, presumably paralyzed. He would continue to live, knowing that he couldn't walk, and if he got his way properly, he would have to be assisted to do daily tasks. He had 6 or 7 minutes to decide before his quirk wore off, and the hero had the option to move again. Though, if he did, he would be an idiot, considering the injuries he would have by then. The hero growled out an attempt at speech. Kaizome simply reinserted his katana into the hero's back, slowly adding pressure until he was sure the spinal cord was severed. He ignored the scream of pain that the false hero let out. Araki Tajiro, Death Arms. A hero simply for the money. Kaizome twisted the katana, narrowing his eyes. You are often drunk on the job as you are now, and constantly make discriminatory comments. He hissed, the rusty taste of blood lingering in his mouth. You are not fit to be a hero. He relished in the howl of pain as he raised his blade and once again opened a wound, this time in the hero's right arm. Your girlfriend might be grateful that she is finally rid of you. 3 years of constant abuse, but she can't do anything. You're a hero, a well-known one too. If she tried to report you, or even just file a restraining order, the hero commission is on her back. Leave Yumiko out of this. Death Arms forced out, his voice high-pitched and pained. Really, it was a miracle that he could speak at all, between Kaizome's quirk and the pain he was undoubtedly feeling. Kaizome considered his response for a moment, continuing his work on getting his blade through Death Arms' arm properly. Kaizome looked at the man below him, disgusted. You pretend you care for her, when really she is just a glorified SLV to you. Feeling the effects of his quirk wearing off, Kaizome began to sever the arm his blade sat in. And I try not to hurt people who do not deserve it. He dug his boot into the open wound in the hero's back to get his point across. I am not like you. Moments before he was finished, he felt the buzzing in the back of his head that indicated his quirk's activation cut off. Evidently, Death Arms sensed it too, as he immediately jumped up, roaring, a desperate man's look on his face. What an idiot. He would die faster at this point. But then Kaizome saw his eyes. This was the look that said, if I'm going down, you're going down with me, B. He would know. He had given and received that look too many times to count. Kaizome gathered himself and stood up, determined. He slipped 2 shorter knives into his palms. He had planned to get this over with quickly, but he relished a proper fight. The bloodier, the better. The hero stumbled towards him, not graceful in the slightest, but quick nonetheless, his right arm connected to his body seemingly by sheer force of will and movements powered by adrenaline. As Death Arms readied a blow, a wordless cry leaving his lips, Kaizome rushed to dodge. If he got hit by that, a broken bone was almost guaranteed, and being who he was, he would have to treat it himself. As much as he knew he could do it, he would be off his game for too long. He had just got back, after all. His legs weren't exactly happy with being suddenly put to use after such a violent tumble, but he pushed through it, rolling forward when they threatened to give out. Death Arms had grazed him, leaving a stinging sensation behind that he rubbed at as Death Arms turned around, swaying. Blood seemingly dripped from everywhere, the stone of the alley practically painted in it. Given the amount of the crimson substance coating their surroundings, he was surprised that Death Arms was still standing. He supposed it was perhaps a mix of the alcohol and adrenaline pumping through his body. Maybe a touch of spite too. He knew that he himself would probably keep moving in such a state. Death Arms stepped forward, another powerful blow at the ready. Kaizome leaped forward from the ground, left ankle screaming, knives first, at the hero's face. The man ahead of him fell to the side in a misguided attempt to save his skin. Not that it would change anything. He would die anyway. He staggered forward, using the hero's failed attempts to get back up against him, and lodged a knife in the brute's large forehead, and smashing it against the floor for good measure. He luxuriated in the crack of his opponent's skull. As he stood up, he noticed the sharp pain in his ankle again. Quickly tugging the list of crimes from his pocket, he attached it to the least blood-stained part of the false hero's costume with a kunai. He'd let the media finish him off. He needed to get back to the apartment and down some painkillers. Hero Killer Strikes Again. Death Arms Dead. By Oki Izanami. This morning, the hero Death Arms was found dead in Mustafu. The hero killer, Stain, is believed to be the culprit due to both a signature from the man himself left at the scene and his 2 murders. And although I acknowledge the tragedy of another hero dead, a recently leaked document tells us that the hero killer's signature was not left on a wall, written in blood, or with a bunch of weapons formed to resemble letters, as many conspiracies and rumors suggest might have been the case. In fact, allegedly, it was simply written on a piece of paper attached to the body by a sword. But that's not the important part. What else was written on the paper is. On it was a list of crimes allegedly committed by the hero. Please note that some of these may not be actual crimes, and all of this is unproven. Intoxication at work, domestic abuse, discrimination, sexism, homophobia, quirk discrimination, unnecessary violence against criminals and villains, abuse of power, associating with known criminals, unheroic motivations. This undoubtedly brings forward the question, what was the truth about hero Death Arms? Did he really do any of these things? And if he didn't, why was the Hero Public Safety Commission trying to keep this from us? More updates soon. Death Arms' ex-girlfriends speak out in the wake of his death. By Murayama Gore. After the release of a sensational, if short, article by Oki Izanami that is sparking many a debate within the hero fan community, 2 of pro-hero Death Arms, may he rest peacefully, ex-girlfriends have spoken out about the alleged mental and physical abuse he put them through during their relationship. Many are outraged, some saying that to speak ill of him now that he is dead is wrong, others saying that the Hero Commission needs to address the rumors circulating before they get too out of hand. The 2 women, both choosing to remain anonymous, have taken to social media to speak about their experiences while in a relationship with the former hero. He used to come in drunk after patrol, and if he didn't arrest anyone he would take out his pent-up rage on me. I didn't speak out because I was scared of what would happen if I did. He's a well-known hero, after all. Alleges one of the women, nicknamed Hannah by many of her followers and supporters in a video on TikTok 7 hours after the death of hero Death Arms. This post was taken down without explanation hours after it was posted, but not before it was shared hundreds of times over several different social medias. Hannah, or at @BubblesBubble on TikTok, has gained over 40,000 followers after her original post. She posted on Twitter her gratitude for the support and her sympathy for anyone who had a similar experience to her. Hours after Hannah's original post, user @GoldenQueer stitched a reposted version of Hannah's OG one, sharing a little of her story. "He never hit me, but I was essentially his servant. He didn't treat me like a person, and I only got out of there because I came out as bisexual to him." She continued on to say, "He was a big role model to his nephew, but that really wasn't a good thing. He taught him that women were worth nothing if not for the tea and breakfast." The video was 3 minutes in total, but split into 2 parts, with the second part being 3 minutes again. Many comments on both videos encouraged GoldenQueer to talk to Hannah and perhaps collaborate in an attempt to get compensation and/or spread the word. Many also asked if these two were the only victims of Death Arm's bigotry and abuse. One such user said, "Hope you and @BubblisBubble are the only victims of this guy. Love ya confidence in speaking out. GL." Despite the overload in popularity and support for both of these women, there are still disbelievers and fans of the former hero making their opinion known. Under the original video from BubblisBubble, user @HeroMaterialno1 stated that he believed that she was just using the attention on Death Arm's death to gain attention. "Stop insulting your dead ex-bro. We all know you are a clout chaser." The response to this comment resulted in the deletion of the user's account a mere 2 hours later. The Hero Commission has organized a press conference surrounding the hero killer. Be sure to watch it. Neo Mesa wanted a break. He was the detective in quirk-based crimes, which, in the job description, landed him with cases of mid to high-scale villainy, often vigilantism cases, and ordinary public quirk use cases. When he agreed to the promotion, he was expecting all of that, as well as more than a few people who just accidentally activated their quirk at the wrong time. The truth is, while he got assigned all of that, he also received every single murder case that was in the station's jurisdiction. This was mainly due to bias, people often assuming that to kill someone you needed to use a quirk. In reality, people generally just did it the old-fashioned way. That usually included a weapon, or, on the odd occasion, poison. And while any sane person might judge him for taking the lives and deaths of others lightly, he couldn't help it. After being the only detective in the station willing to deal with murders that involved more than the cut and dry, it was the boyfriend-husband-wife. He was often left drowning in paperwork and feeling horrendously overworked. He had seen a lot of death, and as much as it pained him to admit it, he had gotten used to it. But that didn't mean he wasn't long overdue for a break. He needed to get away from the despair of the station, especially with Stain now at large again, as prolific as ever. It didn't help that he was fueling doubt in heroes nationwide. Nothing too worrying yet in terms of the Hero Commission's worries surrounding the hero killer, but it was getting close. He wondered if he could get help on his most recent case. Thankfully, it wasn't related to the hero killer, but rather a large decrease in the activity relating to low-level criminals in the less patrolled parts of Mustafu. Some of his underground hero colleagues had noted that it had resulted in a vacuum of villain activity, leading to larger-scale, more dangerous villains attacking. Because of the low hero presence, vigilante cases in the areas affected had doubled. No one knew why this had started in the first place. Sinking his head into his hands, he tried his hardest to focus and not fall asleep. Neo Mesa really needed a break. When Kaizome had come in limping, covered in blood, Izuku had been, rightfully, worried. He hadn't gotten much of an answer from the man himself, Kaizome, smelling like death, choosing to have a shower and then collapse into his bed and pass out instead of explaining. Hopefully he hadn't received any head injuries. The news in the morning had told him everything he needed to know, fortunately. Death Arms, murdered. Stain the executioner. That probably explains the injuries. Death Arms was infamous for his sloppy, brute force approach. It worked, and was efficient in taking down small-time villains, which is probably how he got so high in the rankings despite his obvious sexism and alcoholism. Izuku had always held contempt for the hero, having been barely missed by a stop sign that he had thrown at a villain once. Even if Kaizome was the best at dodging, it would be hard to do it with such an unpredictable opponent. Izuku worries, but he thinks that Kaizome is fine. He convinces himself that Kaizome would be fine. Izuku tries to ignore his feelings by taking a nap, and then throwing himself into training, but even after he was done, the satisfactory ache in his muscles lingering, he came back to his thoughts. Did Death Arms deserve to die? His brain tried to continue down the rabbit hole, but he pushed the thoughts back into the box he kept in the back of his mind. Did Death Arms deserve to die? Izuku knew what Death Arms had done. He had looked at pretty much any news in existence about what happened, and even though many of the articles made him angry, that was Kaizon that they were calling evil and cruel, that was the man who had helped him get away, who had helped him get stronger. The thought ensnared his consciousness, his brain, until it was all he could think about. Did Death Arms deserve to die? The thought had taken up so much space in his brain that it had broken his little cardboard box, the thoughts he had been trying to ignore flying out. Did Feather deserve to die? The thought stung. At some point he had left the apartment, heading out onto the streets he now knew so well, tears and questions burning the back of his eyes. He shoved his hood over his head, his curls already tied back. Hands in his pockets, twirling a small kunai to distract himself, tracing the delicate carving in the handle, his feet on autopilot. It was quiet, more so than usual. When quirks had first become accepted in greater society, crime rates had risen exponentially. With the rise of the vigilante era and later, heroics, the crime rate had lessened, but it was still much, much higher than before quirks. The way they looked at it had been adjusted accordingly, looked at in terms of larger-scale attacks rather than the little things like drag deals and purse snatching, with those little things being less than 1% in terms of how crime rate statistics were calculated. It was a tool designed to deceive. Mizudafu was never this quiet, despite what the crime rate might portray. He stalled, branching off from the main footpath into an arcade nearby, and from there, a lesser-known backstreet. He walked down it for a few minutes, expecting to see something. Maybe a few sketchy-looking figures smoking further down the street, as per usual. Perhaps the heteromorph couple that had tried to sell him drags on several different occasions. Maybe the drunken thieves that often frequented. But it was empty. Silent. Until it wasn't. Bursting in through the same alleyway he had come through, someone in similar dress to him, loose jeans and a hoodie, rolled up to the elbows, sprinted past. He would have been certain that they had a speed quirk if he hadn't seen what looked like tape dispensers on the runner's elbows, below where their hoodie was pooled on their arm. Izuku thanked the universe for his choice of color for that night. His dark color palette blended in well with the shadows left by the unevenly spaced street lights. And while he had no doubt that the person who just sprinted had seen him, having pushed by him in an attempt to gain momentum, he hoped whatever they were running from wouldn't. He wasn't left in suspense for long. A scruffy-looking man with what looked like white hair from what he could make out, strolled in through the arcade, scratching at his neck. The figure stopped, eyes narrowing at the figure that was still running. "Stupid vigilante," the guy muttered. "Messing up my sheet." Izuku tried his best to peer out at the vigilante's rapidly departing form without giving himself away. It was then he realized the vigilante was heading for the dead end, and not the escape. The Izuku assumed he was a villain probably knew this. The vigilante, however, whether it was panic-induced stupidity or genuine inexperience with the geography of Mizudafu, did not. The villain picked up the pace at the exact same time the vigilante realized their mistake. Izuku decided to take the opportunity to slink back onto the main street. This wasn't his business. Izuku continued to wander, twisting and turning through the maze that was Mizudafu, his thoughts now so loud they all blended together. Just as he was considering turning back and returning to the apartment, a middle-aged woman with shoulder-length brown hair jumped off a fire escape into a dumpster right in front of him. She cleaned herself, panting, sporting a swollen black eye. It took her a moment to register Izuku. She raked her eyes over him, but obviously decided he wasn't a threat, as she started clambering out of the bin, shaking, eyes blown wide. She approached Izuku, limping, the smell of blood lingering on her. He hoped it wasn't her own. Tears leaked from her eyes as she grabbed his shoulder. "If my daughter comes down here, tell her that I'm sorry, okay? Tell her I can't do it anymore." The woman's violent shaking shook him where she grabbed him, her contact strong. He nodded slowly. Apparently relieved of some sense of duty, she moved on, running as fast as her busted ankle would take her. As soon as the woman had departed, The loud clanging of the fire escape alerted him to someone else's arrival. "Mama! Mama!" A girl's voice cried out. He moved so he could see the owner of the voice. He knew that he should just go, but he was curious, and unlike his previous encounter, he didn't think he was in danger if he was spotted. He stayed silent, gazing up at what he assumed was the woman's daughter. They looked quite alike, but the girl's hair was darker and shorter. She looked about the same age as him. She looked out from the balcony desperately, craning her neck to try and look into the street below. The first thing he noticed was that her head was bleeding. A lot. He wanted to help, but a male voice called out, deep and threatening, and she left just as quick as she had come, running back up the stairs, her face hardening as she wiped her tears. He stared for a while longer, frozen, and then made to leave. "Kaizome, what did Death Arms do, really? I want to hear it from you." Abused his girlfriend, his kid too. Scum of the earth. Izuku thinks he understood a little better now why Death Arms had to die. If he did anything remotely similar to what he had seen done to those women, that girl, he still remembered her face when the man called her name. Death Arms deserved to rot. 3 weeks after Death Arms' death, Kaizome announced that they were moving. A drag bust a few doors down had caused police to steadily begin to search more and more of the apartments in their building, on the suspicion that the building was a base or a hotspot for a larger drag-supplying organization. It wouldn't be surprising, Izuku supposed. But obviously, it meant that they had to move. He could tell that, in Kaizome's eyes, it was a long time coming. It probably was. Online, people were analyzing Stain's past patterns and were starting to recognize that they had changed, and whispers of a copycat killer had begun to float around. It took 3 hours for the two of them to pack everything up and end up on a train to Hosu. Kaizome had his hood up, long black hair spilling out over his shoulders. He was wearing a face mask designed for mutant quirks to hide his identifiable lack of a nose. It was relatively lax, considering the fact his face was plastered all over the news day after day. He guessed that was why they had left on the earliest train possible. Izuku was staring out over his newest cheap phone, across the train from Kaizome. The two of them had figured that traveling together would be strange, especially given his age and how Kaizome, despite his best efforts, would probably look quite creepy standing or sitting with him. So here he was, listening to indie rock in one crappy cheap earphone while he observed the train from his spot sitting up against the window at the back of the train. He had his legs up on the seat to prevent anyone sitting with him, as well as using the position of his body to observe both the door on his left and the seats in front of him, all while achieving the look of an edgy teenager. He thanked every power in the universe for the early morning quiet on the train, not many people heading to work or school yet, meaning the train was empty and he could sit down. His legs were sore from training a couple of days ago, and he would have been worried about how the jostling of people and the train might have dislodged one of the knives he had strapped to his arms and legs. The train ride was uneventful, and Izuku had taken up free online coding classes recently in an attempt to cure his boredom, and he had messed with the phone system a bit. He hadn't really done anything, but he had figured out how to muck around with the settings enough to access the code underneath it. He liked learning about things like that, and he vaguely wondered, as he and Kaizome disembarked the train, if, in some faraway universe, he could have gotten involved in support items and stuff like that. Maybe. But, if that had happened, if he had never met Kaizome, he would either be dead, or some strange version of Midoriya Izuku that he wouldn't recognize. He distracted himself from the thoughts of what could have been by turning down his music and focusing on Kaizome as he weaved through the crowd at the station, following a safe distance behind. Izuku breathed through the stress of being in the midst of so many people for the first time in weeks. He made sure he managed his breathing, focusing entirely on the gray-white hoodie making its way through the crowd in front of him, making sure he was far enough away that it would be suspicious or weird, but close enough to see the long, black flyaways making their way out of the confines of Kaizome's hoodie. Izuku could see the way Kaizome was tense, hands in pockets, and he could picture Kaizome's bunched fists. He knew that his mentor was fighting himself not to just tuck his hair into the ponytail that he was so comfortable with. But Izuku was the one who had given the idea that maybe Kaizome should wear his hair out. It was an interesting concept that he had decided to bring up. He didn't quite know the name of the theory, but it was basically that if you weren't presenting yourself the way people expected you to, or in an environment people expected you to be in, that was all the disguise you needed. Of course, Kaizome was wearing the face mask as a caution, but in every picture of him released to the public he was wearing his gear, with his hair tied back in an attempt to keep it out of his face and also mask the real length of it. Also, not many people here would expect the hero killer to be wandering about the Hosu train station during the rush to get to work or school. Izuku huffed quietly. All of this thought about hair and ponytails was making the small one in the back of his head pull a little too hard on his scalp. He pulled it out, switching it for a loose half-up half-down, before pulling his hood over his head again. He checked the phone he was using to see what song was humming quietly in his left ear, when he noticed the date. Tuesday, July 18th, 0653. The words stood out, seemingly glowing brighter than anything else on his screen, stalling for a moment, before starting to move again. He tucked his phone back into his pocket, music forgotten. Focusing on Kaizome's location, Izuku let himself turn on autopilot. How the f had he turned 15 without realizing? When the two of them arrived at the apartment building Kaizome had yet again threatened someone into giving them an apartment in, it was the shell-shocked look on Izuku's face that put him on edge. Guiding the two of them into their new home, he kept an eye on the kid's behavior, looking for a reason that he seemed to look uneasy and unsure of himself. His guard immediately up, surveying their surroundings, he slipped into the fire escape, despite them being on the floor they were supposed to be on. What happened? He asked, hands on hips. Izuku blinked and took a deep breath, his facial expression turning flat, with his eyes flicking between Kaizome and a mold stain on the wall beside them. Nothing. Kaizome didn't believe it. Bullshit. What happened? Izuku's face flickered for a moment, before he appeared to wrangle it back to its passive state. It's nothing, okay? Nothing happened. Pressing his lips together, Kaizome sighed. Ruffling Izuku's hair affectionately as he passed, noticing how Izuku let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but not quite, and fixed his hair back into the hairstyle it was in before, he walked back into the hallway. Apartment, welcome to Home Sweet Home, version 2. He let out a small laugh. At least it was nicer than the last 7 apartments he had stayed in. It had furniture, probably belonging to whatever unfortunate soul had lived here previously. He wasn't going to complain. He watched Izuku survey the living room intently before tucking himself into the corner of the couch and whip out a notebook from seemingly nowhere. Personally deciding to organize sleeping arrangements, Kaizome checked out the bedroom, tying his hair back as he walked. Western-style bed frame, no mattress. There was broken glass on top of where a vanity had clearly been, the dent in the carpeting pale, excluding the glittery shimmer here and there. Thankfully, on inspection, it appeared to be some sort of makeup. The window was big enough and low enough to jump out of. The wardrobe was empty, save for the dust lining the shelves and drawers. The bedroom seemed clean, so that was good. Considering the fact that generally only one of the 2 new inhabitants of the apartment would sleep at a time, they were fine with just the couch. The bedroom would probably only be used for emergency escapes and storage of clothing. The bathroom was next on his hygiene check. On first glance, it was gaudy, a bright shade of pink being the coloring of nearly everything in the room. Pacing around the small room, he checked the toilet, the shower, the sink, and the small cupboard under the sink. It mostly appeared to be clean, a thin layer of dust coating everything, and the only thing of note was the full bottles of shampoo and conditioner as well as what looked like a body wash that were inside the cupboard. Happy with the overall state of the place, he wandered back into the main room, where Izuku was working up a silent mutter storm, his mouth moving wordlessly as he scribbled in his notebook. Settling on the couch, he picked up the phone he was currently using, having felt a notification buzz in his pocket while he was walking. It was from Dabi. Mastubra is hiring again. Tried through Jiren. Kaizome wrinkled what was left of his nose at the message. How much money was he offering? Not enough to get Jiren on board. Close though. A low hiss slipped through his teeth as he tried to stop himself from cursing. The good thing is that if Matsubara was planning on finding Izuku again, he would probably struggle, considering they weren't in Mustafu anymore and Izuku no longer had a registered address, or a registered anything. The only bad thing is that Jiren, someone who Matsubara was obviously seeking out, knew where Kaizome, and as an extension, Izuku, was. At least Jiren didn't have a policy of betraying his customers, unless being paid obscene amounts of money. They would be safe for now, assuming things went as planned. Grabbing his katana and a couple of his throwing knives from his backpack, and strapping them onto his back and arms, he looked at a map of the area they were in. Now that it was dark, Kaizome was restless and bored. Izuku had just come out from a shower, curls dark and dripping onto his hoodie. Want to go explore? Izuku seemed to consider for a moment, before agreeing. It didn't take long before the two of them were exploring the dark alleyways of Hosu together. Being a new city that he wasn't overly familiar with, Kaizome wanted to learn the lay of the land before he started activity in the area he couldn't be caught unawares. It was often the difference between life and death, or injury and coming out clean. He hadn't lost a nose only to learn. Nothing. We should make sure to avoid people. This late at night it is probably not so smart considering we aren't familiar with the area. Izuku said, eyes narrowed, words mirroring his thoughts. Nodding in agreement, they moved away from the lights flickering in the building on their left. Referencing their map, they worked their way through the high rises, avoiding the hero agencies and police stations littering the city. They didn't notice the woman that took a photo as they passed by. Stain rumored to be working with an accomplice. Hero killer has a partner in crime? Hero killer and accomplice spotted in Hosu. What is the police doing about Stain? Toshinori tapped his foot impatiently, smiling wide. His injuries ached particularly badly today, and as much as he hated to think it, he really needed a lie down. The reporters surrounding him were unfortunately the only things standing in his way. They were all asking about the latest news on the hero killer, bothering him with questions that not even the heroes or police on the case knew of. He quite disliked this part of being a hero. The questions. All Might, sir, what do you say to Stain's recent lack of interest in you? Sir, what has happened with the recent discovery of Stain's partner? All Might, do you think you are in danger of the hero killer? His smile tightened. My dearest apologies, citizens, but I have run out of time to talk. He made his way out of the circle of reporters clamoring for his attention. He was thankful that another, younger hero caught the horde's eye once he left. De-transforming, he called Nao Mesa to pick him up. Hey Toshi, how are you going? The police officer sounded tired, the exhaustion in his voice practically palpable despite his upbeat tone. I'm well. Nao Mesa, do you mind picking me up? I'm up the street from Endeavor's agency, he said, scratching his elbow awkwardly. Sure, give me a few minutes. Did you run out of time? Nao Mesa said, the sound in the background of his call slowly getting louder, probably as the man left his office. Pretty much, he sighed. I really do need a successor soon. I would suggest perhaps looking into hero legacy families. But, we have talked about this before, to no avail. I'll see you there, yes? Toshinori nodded to himself, before replying to Nao Mesa and ending the call. Breathing through the pain, he mentally thanked Nizu for the job at UA. He'd need it to successfully retire. God knows he needed the break. You can't save everyone after all. Taking a breath, eyes narrowing, Izuku circled Kaizome, mind whirring away with strategies and ways he could lose horribly. Or, to be exact, all 7 billion ways he had lost horribly to Kaizome in the past. Over time, of course, Izuku had gotten to know Kaizome's fighting styles and techniques, but he didn't have the experience that his mentor did, so he didn't always manage to get the upper hand, and obviously, when faced with a different opponent, with a completely different fighting style, he would struggle to cope. So Kaizome had combined his imaginative side and sadistic streak in a mixing bowl with a shitty sense of humor and decided to try to copy the fighting styles of different heroes. Of course, given Izuku's obsessive note-taking about heroes in the past, Kaizome never told him who it was that he was imitating. And given that the performance usually wasn't perfect, it usually took him longer than usual to figure out who he was facing. Kaizome wasn't about exaggeration, unfortunately, so whenever they sparred, Izuku had to be very careful, watching his movements and mannerisms like a hawk. Izuku observed Kaizome's stance. Today, he was standing tall, hands in pockets, glaring out at the world, but his face was devoid of a scowl. That probably meant that today he was in for it. Letting his breath out, Izuku nodded, starting the fight. Instantly he was on the defensive, as Kaizome leapt at him, ferocity in every movement. He sloppily blocked the kick aimed his way, took the hit to the face and ducked under the punch. The two of them quickly entered a dance of hitting, blocking and ducking, Izuku using his more lithe frame to his advantage. They were at it for hardly 2 minutes before the fight was over, Izuku being caught unawares by a fake-out. He met Kaizome's eyes, his own bright with determination, and got up. Again. He was answered with a nod. Izuku got the first hit this time. The fighting style included a lot of different martial arts, and it was a lot more coordinated than some of the other styles Kaizome had imitated previously. He also seemed a lot more familiar with it, his movements only unsure or jerky every once in a while, and when they were, it was more similar to not being sure how to compensate for something, rather than being unsure of what his character would do. His distraction led to him getting a sharp kick to the gut. Giving himself a moment to catch his breath, he got back up and tried to think. Again, he said, getting back to his feet. Get out of your head. Focus on the fight. Kaizome's practiced familiarity once again became apparent to him in the fluidity of his movements, the confidence in the way he had beaten him 4 times in a row, with barely any mistakes. He was definitely learning, but shit, it made him think. Another punch to the face that he just barely dodged. All in all, Kaizome had definitely fought this hero more than once. Well, Chizone definitely knew how to get into character, but that was a well-known fact already. Matsubara Tetsuo has hit a dead end, yet again. First Jiren, then Chisaki, then Fukayu, then Dabi, who is notorious for always taking the job. All he wants is someone to track down Midoriya Izuku, the boy who left his poor mother, Tetsuo's sweet, darling girlfriend in tears, and probably killed his most prized employee. Unfortunately, every person he asks denies him anything. He doesn't know why all of these people are protecting a quirkless shitstain just to get back at him for something. He isn't yet quite sure what, yet, but he'll figure it out. It's just a setback for now. Hissing through his teeth, he examined the papers Madam President had sent through to him regarding training a new project now that Hawks had graduated from the program. Nizu had provided the commission with some of their most promising applicants. For now they just had names, faces and quirks to go off of, but flicking through the profiles, he couldn't wait for the exams. The footage was sure to be good. Of the students, 3 in particular stood out to him. Todoroki Shudo, the second of Endeavor's children to be considered for the YMH program, Bakugu Katsuki, a boy with a squeaky clean record and an exemplary explosion quirk, and Uraraka Ochako, a nobody with one of the most powerful gravity quirks he had ever heard of. He'd keep an eye out for them once UA released the tapes of the exams. He should expect a good show this year. Sitting up in his chair, another quirk caught his eye, brainwashing, Shinso Hitoshi. Nodding to himself, he circled the boy's name. There was absolutely no way in hell he was letting that one go, not when his quirk could be so useful for what he wanted. He was in foster care, so it wouldn't be an issue to obtain him. Sending a message through to Madam President to confirm the boy's placement in the program. He also informed her of how he was adding another place into the program. He wasn't going to waste all of his cards on one boy with a brainwashing quirk, after all. Slowly easing himself out of his chair, he made his way along the hallway and towards reception. The Australian hero in turn stood by the desk, falling into attention when she saw him. He briefly wondered why Japanese heroes weren't trained like this. He smiled down at her, making sure to stand an appropriate distance away. He didn't want another intimidation complaint. He was already on thin ice as it was with Madam. He wanted to work his way up, not down. You're here to get your Japanese license validated, correct? He waited a small time for the young woman to understand the words, before continuing on. I usually don't manage this type of area, but the woman who manages international licensing is currently off work, so I'll help you today. He made sure to slow his words down so they were comprehensible to the intern. Turning on his heel, gesturing for her to follow, he made his way back to his office. Quickly concealing the papers he was looking at earlier, he brought out the required paperwork. Just sign where required, and then I'll walk you through the procedures you'll need to follow, but Best Jeanist should do that for you as well. Hitoshi almost ignored the knock on the door. He wasn't stupid, he was home alone, and the only defense he had was his quirk, which, you know. But when the bell rang, echoing through the house, curiosity won. He wondered if it was a parcel, and Yumiko probably wouldn't be happy if he didn't get the parcel for her. When he opened the door, ready to slam it at a moment's notice, he was shocked to find two professional-looking men standing on the stoop. He was expecting a DLVY boy, maybe a social worker, perhaps even a serial killer. This was not on the list of possibilities. "Is your sister home?" one of the men said, in thick, accented Japanese. It only took 4 words for all distrust to fly out the window. If these were two random people, surely they wouldn't know that he lived with his sister. They would probably say something like, "Are your parents home?" if they didn't know who he was. No one knew that Yumiko was his sister, not his mother. He shook his head. "No, sir." The same man responded, unperturbed. "Could you call her for us?" He fumbled to get his phone out of his pocket, nodding. "Put on speakerphone, please." He glanced up. "Sure. Yes. Sir." Yumiko took 7 long, awkward seconds to pick up. "Hitoshi-chan? I'm almost done with my meeting. I'll be home in what do you need?" Nervously flicking his eyes up to the men on the stoop, he managed to get out a basic explanation. "I'll take it from here, Shinsoku-in, okay?" Man number 1 said, stepping into the house. He nodded, handing over his phone. "You can sit on the couch over there. I'll go and make tea." He didn't wait for a response before he scurried off into the kitchen. Sighing heavily and internally commending himself for such good social interaction skills, he allowed himself to block out the noise of the call going on in the room adjacent to him. Taking as long as he possibly could to make the tea without looking suspicious, he built his social battery back up bit by bit. He was not expecting company today. It took 3 hours to negotiate the terms, but it was official. Shinso Hitoshi was going to be a hero. It took all of his energy to not whoop at the top of his lungs. He was going to be a motherfucking hero. Fuyumi's smile didn't mask the bags under her eyes, nor did it hide the burn peeking up above her shirt's neckline, but it comforted him somewhat. It was familiar, a stark contrast to the gates looming in front of him. "Yue Shudo. I'm sure that you must feel so proud of yourself," his sister said, and her hands were steady when she put a hand on his shoulder. Forcing his own shaking hands into fists, trying to quell his hands into becoming steady. "You're not him. She knows that. That's why she's able to be so calm." It didn't work. She was wrong. He wasn't proud. He wasn't even satisfied, like Endeavor was. He was terrified. What if all everyone saw, when they looked at him, was a carbon copy of his father? What if they were right? Swallowing his anxiety, he nodded, words deciding to evade him when he needed them most. Her smile brightened at his confirmation, and when he finally forced his body into cooperating, turning towards the entrance, she gave him a gentle push on his shoulder. Once he was inside the gates, he almost broke into a run. He was just desperate to get inside. He felt like there were a billion eyes on him, waiting for him to make a mistake. But he couldn't embarrass himself like that, not in front of the people he was supposed to defeat. Not in front of the people he had to Serpa. Truthfully, he didn't even know if he wanted to be a hero at all. Not that it mattered. Endeavor was the one that got to make the decision. Speed walking into the building, he brought up the image of the map he had studied memorized in his mind, making his way to classroom 1A. He was early, but that was preferable to on time, when everyone would be coming in. He wasn't here to make friends, and even if he did, he doubted that they would stick around for long. There was already another person in the room, to Shudo's disappointment. Finding his seat number 15, right at the back, he was grateful that he was nowhere near the blonde boy that had somehow managed to arrive before him. Deciding that scrolling on his phone would be preferable to staring at the front until class started, he began looking through the news. There was nothing too interesting happening. The normal All Might sightings, people saying that they saw Stain here, Dikairu there. The usual. The gossip channels had something new, though, and it was front page on quite a few well-known gossip outlets. Apparently, his father was seen with another woman outside a love hotel. He had to refrain from laughing out loud. These things always showed up every year or two, and often he could have a good laugh with his siblings about it. But this year, Natsuo had moved out, and Shudo was going to be at UA a lot of the time. Fuyumi was trying to keep them from drifting apart, but it was already too late. He doubted that this time he would be able to laugh with his siblings and pretend that they weren't strangers for once. The thought instantly made his mood plummet, and the anxiety twisting in his stomach that he couldn't quite suppress returned. Swiping out of the article, putting his phone all way as people began to filter into the room. The first in was a boy with blue hair and glasses. He immediately began to reprimand the boy that was there before him, the blonde one. He was distracted from the commotion the two were making by a girl with a mutant quirk and pink hair and a boy with bright red, spiky hair. They were obviously familiar with each other, bumping their fists together as they walked in. Next was a girl with large horns on her head, quickly followed by a girl with brown hair that covered her eyes. One by one his classmates filtered in. A nervous-looking boy that resembled a rock, a tall, brown-haired boy that was eating a cupcake as he walked in, a girl that was apparently invisible. The last one to come in was a tired-looking boy with large contraptions on his elbows, his most defining feature the handprint scar that seemed to place a dent on his neck and chin. His classmates began to chat, people forming groups of 2 or 3 and striking up conversations. This was all stopped when a dark-haired man seemingly appeared at the podium. People quickly moved to seats under the glare that was sent their way. That took too long. Make sure that you get to your seats quicker next time. Black eyes surveyed the room. I am Aizawa Shota, and I will be your homeroom teacher this year. We will be starting right away. Get a sports uniform and head to the grounds. There was a scramble as people tried to quickly make their way out of their desk. The room almost immediately erupted with noise, but everyone seemed to be heading in the right direction. And so it began. Day 1 of UA for Todoroki Shudo. He was going to be a hero, no matter what he wanted. Achiko was ushered through white hallways by a woman wearing a blue surgical mask. This would have been her first day of UA, had she got in. But she hadn't, not collecting enough points in the practical. For a moment, when she had received the results, her world had shattered. She had tried to hide away from her father as she opened the letter, but he was there as All Might's voice told her she was 3 points short. It had been silent in their apartment, for a second, and Achiko had held her breath, waiting for the disappointed look that was sure to come. He was sober at least, so she didn't have to worry about more than that, but it didn't stop the fact she braced herself for the impact. It never came, interrupted by a knock on the door. Her father had walked up to the door, eyes narrowed, muttering about idiot landlords. What he had opened the door to, however, was 2 men in expensive-looking suits, saying that she could become a hero. They said that the Hero Commission wanted to train her. Her dad agreed, of course, glad for the payment that was offered in exchange for her services. Achiko hadn't known what to feel. She had been practically sold, almost like those silly stories she used to watch on YouTube, but she could do what she had always wanted, become a hero. Maybe then Mum would come back and be proud of her. In the end, she had no choice in the matter, anyway. So, she let herself be led into a large office, where she was met with 2 people. One was a tall man whose wide smile seemed less than genuine, and one being a boy, about her age, with purple hair that was cut short and eyebags about as deep as the Mariana Trench. He was wearing the same black t-shirt and pants she had been given that morning. The man sitting at the desk spoke, startling her. Hello, Achiko. My name is Matsubata Tetsuo, and I run the program you have been selected for. He pointed towards the purple boy. That is Hitoshi, and although he has been in the program a while longer than you, I'm sure you'll learn the ropes soon enough. Welcome to the Youth Heroes program. Achiko had no choice but to smile in response to his cheery tone. She was going to be a hero whatever it takes. It had been 4 months since some stupid reporter had photographed him with Kaizome, and 4 months since Izuku had officially become Dikairu, in the eyes of the law. It was fun, watching the police and the news speculate on who he was. Was he 17, or 20 of 13? Was he Stain's kid, or was he a poor victim of a kidnapping? Some of the theories were too close for comfort, but none of them were accurate enough for any further action, other than a post in response using widely inaccurate facts about himself to debunk it. Both a lot and nothing had changed in the last few months. He still trained with Kaizome, and he still wandered about late at night, but now when he went on his late-night walks, he usually had a goal in mind. He hadn't earned the moniker, Hero Stalker, for nothing after all. 3 more heroes were dead at Stain's hand, all with a list of crimes found on or near the body. They were more extensive than the first one. It was at 4:30 in the morning that Izuku walked back into the Hosu apartment, where Kaizome currently was sleeping. Or, should be sleeping. It was never a guaranteed thing with Kaizome. But, just in case he was, Izuku didn't go check. He made himself useful by pottering around in the kitchen, trying to make himself something with what meager groceries that they had left from the week. Unfortunately for Izuku's stomach, someone barged in through the front door. Izuku put down the knife when he noticed who it was. Those scars were recognizable from a mile away, and despite not having seen the guy properly since their little chat on a rooftop a while ago, Izuku knew who it was. "Hey Dabi. Long time no see." He was answered with a playful smirk. "Grown some ball, have we?" Dabi took a cigarette out of his pocket, looking like he was about to light it, before Izuku managed to steal it and put it in his own pocket. "Not that the news couldn't have told me that. Dikairu this, Dikairu that. You're famous, kid." Dabi continued, narrowing his eyes at the theft. "Don't listen to the news." Izuku resumed, trying to make something edible out of seaweed and dragon fruit. He was failing, but it never hurt to try. "It's hard not to, when it's jumping out at me. Take a break, I can't stand seeing your ugly hoodies all over the news." "Hey!" Izuku side-eyed Dabi. How did you even get in here, anyway?" "I locked the door." A magician never tells his secrets. "What do you want, idiot?" He pouted. "Just to see my favorite Stain fanboy, of course." Dabi leaned against the counter, staring directly into his eyes. Izuku let out a fake hiss. "I'm not a Stain fanboy. If anything, Kaizome's an Izuku fanboy." Izuku put his hand on his hips. "And I'm the Queen of England. You can be whatever you want to be," Izuku said in a high-pitched tone, fluttering his eyelashes. He lasted exactly 3 seconds before cracking up, comfortable in the strange familiarity the home intruder provided. Dabi rolled his eyes. Izuku was glad that being a hero was never on the table for him. He never would have gotten moments like this, with strange villains he didn't know why he trusted. Just a little bit. It had been a good week. Sensei was paying attention to him, and he was going to kill All Might. Today, the beginning and end of a legacy. It was going to be so good. They couldn't fail, not with Nomu, and especially not with Sensei. All Might is a cheater. Him and his stupid hero kids. Shudo emerged from the USJ beaten, burned, frozen, and tired. At least he was the only one. At least Azui wasn't disintegrating. At least All Might was alive, and at least Aizawa was in the ambulance ahead of him, getting help. Shudo was fine. Shudo, despite his injuries and exhaustion, tried to stand tall, imitating how his father stood after a fight. If there was one thing Endeavor was good for, it was teaching him how to pretend to be fine. But when the paramedics approached him for the checkup they were doing for everyone, he couldn't hide the way he shivered, the cold going bone deep, and he definitely couldn't hide the way thin layers of ice crawled up his right side, sticking to where bruises were already forming. They wouldn't let him say he was fine, unfortunately, and Shudo dreaded the moment that Endeavor found out about how weak he had been. He already realized it himself. He didn't need to hear what he already knew from Endeavor, who undoubtedly would add on some sort of consequence that, although he probably deserved, he didn't want to deal with. Hopefully, Shudo thought, "It is Fuyumi that comes to pick me up." As he is loaded into the ambulance, his legs having failed him the moment he tried to stand up again, insisting that he was okay, he was going to be fine, he would just call his sister. Despite all his best efforts, he made his way to the hospital in an ambulance, a hero he couldn't quite remember the name of, sitting in the chair beside the stretcher. Before they shut the doors, Shudo managed to catch a glance of the glacier peeking out from the top of the building. Tamura was getting patched up, the bullet wounds being bandaged by Kurogyri, the frost burns he had creeping up his side already having been treated, when Sensei's voice made its way through the speaker in the TV. "Tamura, I understand that your attack on UA was a failure, but no matter. Consider it a learning experience. Now, where do you think you went wrong?" He scowled, thinking, "That ice brat. He ruined everything." Tamura remembered the boy emerging from one of the zones, already bleeding, and Tamura acting like an amateur, thinking that he was a weak effing NPC if he couldn't handle a few of the cannon fodder he had recruited. But it had barely been 10 seconds before Nomu, and half the building had been engulfed in ice. He was still said that All Might had managed to jump out of the way in time. And the effing ice weakened Nomu so that All Might could punch it into the sky when it freed itself. Now the stupid heroes would be able to get to it. He had been such an amateur, he was better than this. He was supposed to be weak, but he cheated. He grumbled. All Might or the student? Both. Sensei was quiet for a second and Tamura could practically feel the way Sensei's brain was ticking through the screen. Did it seem like the boy had any strange aspects to his quirk that he shouldn't have had anything seemingly unrelated to his ice? Tamura shook his head, before remembering that Sensei couldn't quite see him. No. Just a sheet load of ice. He growled, scratching at his neck. The itch was back. Beside him, Kurogiri twitched. Glaring at the warper, Tamura waited for Sensei's response. I'll look into it. For now, Tamura, I would advise that you try and heal. And then the screen shut off. It was Fuyumi who arrived at the hospital and not Endeavor. She was still in the outfit she wore to teach, so Shudo assumed she had been made to run out of work for him. Sorry. He managed to apologize before she said anything. Fuyumi was not the type to get angry, but he was inconveniencing her, and eventually, when you do that too much, people snap. He had the proof of that fact marring the skin over his left eye. Shudo, what could you possibly be sorry for? I'm the one who should be apologizing. I should have made it here much sooner. Her eyes were full of pity. He was sure he did look quite the pitiful thing. The only one of his class that needed to be brought to hospital. Turns out he had fractured his arm fighting the guy with the shockwave quirk, and the blue-haired woman with the knives had managed to get a cut just above his ear deep enough for stitches. He was also suffering from major quirk overuse, but he couldn't have helped the panic he felt seeing Aizawa practically dead under some creature's fist. Their teacher still managed to save Azui from the decaying villain though. He'd never forget that, and Shudo could remember the fear he had felt when the villain had reached out at his classmate. He didn't want to see anyone die. When he had burst out of the fire zone, bruised and in pain, having escaped a particularly annoying villain by encasing them in ice, and noticed that All Might had finally arrived, but, somehow, was losing, Shudo did the only thing he could think of doing, using his mother's quirk. It had burst out of him, almost unwillingly. The ice almost encased All Might, his careful control. Disappearing in his adrenaline and panic. Where is Endeavor? He asks, shifting slightly so that he is sitting up on the bed. And when will I be discharged? The nurses told me that you would be told. Fuyumi sighs, sitting down in the chair on the side of his bed. They just have to do a final checkup and you'll be fine. She ignores his second question that couldn't mean anything good. Fuyumi begins talking again, but he lets the words jumble themselves in his brain. He was far too tired to listen to his sister talk, especially when the looming threat of Endeavor was ever present. He let himself float, disconnecting himself from whatever kept him tethered to reality. He was so tired. Yue had been attacked, and Izuku couldn't help but think that if, somehow, he had managed to make it into Yue's hero course, that would have been him at the mercy of villains within the first week of school. He frowned at the TV. Just another one of the hero's failures. He turned towards the door frowning. Kaizome still wasn't back yet. Turning back towards the TV, he wondered quietly when he would get to Beach about what had happened to him. He was already itching to just talk shit. Crowds really were an exceptional hiding spot, especially at events like this. People were often too focused on the object of their attention, or themselves, to notice others. Unfortunately, they were also quite loud. The volume was another great tool for being inconspicuous, but, really, was the discomfort really worth it? But, sitting in the stands at the UA Sports Festival was probably worth it. Watching these people, his own age, display skills and quirks that were, quite frankly, awesome, was a fair trade-off for the noise. Izuku was a bit unhappy that Kaizome hadn't come with him, but he supposed that it was understandable, given that the two of them in one place as crowded and as heavily guarded as this was just asking for trouble, but it was disappointing nonetheless. The attack on UA had been a large point of focus for the news for a while, thankfully getting the attention off of himself and Kaizome, who had been going out progressively later and later for recon, using the media's distraction as a cloak as people's attention was shifted elsewhere. But right now, Kaizom was, hopefully, getting some much-needed sleep. The competitors in this year's sports festival were certainly interesting. There was a girl with an acid quirk and pink skin, two guys with practically the same quirk, the ability to change the properties of their skin, and a pink-haired girl from the support course with some really interesting inventions. He chose to ignore Kakin. He already knew all about him. But there was a boy who stood out almost like a lone flower in a field of corn, and it wasn't just his unique appearance, his quirk. His quirk was so versatile and powerful. Even if ice quirks weren't necessarily uncommon, they were rarely so powerful, and according to Present Mike, who was yelling out through the speaker, his quirk was half cold, half hot. There was more. Holy shit. And Izuku wasn't stupid. He knew that this was Todoroki Shuto, son of Endeavor. Endeavor wasn't a real hero, but, unfortunately, a man that high in the hero ranks knows to hide his secrets, and something that is absolutely certain is that Endeavor has a few too many of them. And, logically, what else would the number 2 be teaching his son and successor if not to follow in his footsteps? But Izuku couldn't let a quirk like that go to waste. He was itching to go sneak around. But this was UA, and there is no way in hell he could go sneaking around without detection. He tried to focus on the kids looking for a team in the cavalry battle. This should be interesting. This shouldn't be happening. He had always done his best, had always done his FNG best to be good, so why? In the end, running into Todoroki was a complete accident. It was the lunch break, and Izuku was wandering around the less populated areas aimlessly. He couldn't get food from anywhere, considering a few key features of his face were plastered all across the news more often than he would have ever have liked. And people are trigger happy, so even slightly looking like him could mean a dozen reports that he was cited. He was about to head back to his seat, thinking about who might win. Unfortunately, Kakin had a pretty good chance of coming first, but there were a few people who might be able to get past him, namely the boy with the copycat quirk. Despite needing more combat training, the guy was smart, if maybe a little brash. He was starting to mutter, so he stopped himself, looking around to see if any of the people wandering around had noticed, and all was good, until, in the corner of his eye, he spotted some very distinct red and white hair. Trying to glance at the boy as subtly as he could, he realized that yes, indeed, that was Todoroki. And Todoroki was glaring at him. Well, he wasn't quite glaring, but there was definitely an intensity to his gaze, and Izuku could already tell he was about to put 2 and 2 together. Double sheet, this was not good. He didn't bother to try and hide that he was looking anymore, choosing to make direct eye contact with him, in an attempt to scare him off, maybe. He didn't quite know. All he knew was that he should probably leave now. Present Mike was advertising something in the background, and the crowd was starting to head back to their seats, conversations picking back up, the noise buzzing in the back of his head. He didn't tear his eyes from the blue and gray eyes in front of them. They looked sad and angry, and a bell was ringing in the back of his head. Where had he seen those eyes before? He needed to go, his brain reminded him. He didn't move. Stop, please. All he could think of was Tenya. But he was alone. The pacing boy in the corner of his eye had simply been a curiosity, a distraction from the words of his father circling around his head. Shuto didn't quite know what was off about him. He was wearing a mask, with round, tinted glasses that probably indicated that he had a quirk that was sensitive to light in some way, because it wasn't bright enough here to need sunglasses, or really tinted glasses of any kind, really. The boy was probably around his age, and when you looked hard enough, you couldn't miss the toned muscles, and the way he walked and stood indicated that he was either a dancer or a fighter specializing in dodging and getting a hit unexpectedly. He would know it was usually the only way you could get a hit in hand-to-hand against a bigger opponent. The boy's green, curly ponytail sat at the nape of his neck, bouncing as he paced and muttered quietly to himself. All in all, this was likely another hero student, coming to scope out the competition. Suddenly, they were making eye contact, and it was kind of disturbing how he couldn't exactly see the shade of the boy's eyes, but he could still definitely feel the intensity of them, almost like they were glowing. Probably an eye-based quirk then. Maybe a laser eye quirk or an eye contact hypnotism quirk then. They would both explain the glasses. He couldn't quite read the boy's expression, given the way his face was covered, but he thinks that he reads a bit of fear? He sighed, breaking their staring contest. Why, out of all of the things people could see in him, Did they always see his father? Red and blue lights. Maybe it was okay to hope. Izuku tries his hardest not to run, but it's hard when he was trying very hard not to panic. But, screw him, he didn't want to leave. He had put so much effort into sneaking in the first place, and there was still the combat rounds to go. So, he was going to live in denial for a bit. In his rush and distraction, he physically banged into what felt like a brick wall, moving in the opposite direction, and just a moment after he started apologizing, he registered blue, stick-straight hair, sapphire blue eyes and glasses, bowing, 90-degree angle and everything. This was Ida Tenya. Hero Class 1A. Not another one. I am deeply sorry, civilian. That was my fault for not looking where I was going, and I will do my best to be more spatially aware in the future. Izuku didn't quite know what to say. He rubbed his hand in the back of his neck, while Ida stayed in his deep bow. I really do think it was my fault, but I accept your apology. Izuku really just wanted to get past him before he realized anything. No need to bow. Ida stood up quickly, pencil-straight posture and all. Thank you for your forgiveness. Now, I really must be going. They shared a moment where neither moved for a second, but before long, Ida was lost in the crowd hurrying to get back to their seats. Izuku sighed, relived, and sprinted all the way back to his seat. Izuku was going to be so mad at him. All it took was one look at the news and Izuku was seething. Kaizomi had made a big mistake. What the F happened? You were supposed to be at home. Izuku glared out at Kaizomi from under his curls, which were now springing up, free of the ponytail. Preferably asleep. Kaizomi scoffed. Like you get much more sleep. You are missing the point. We never discussed anything about Ingenium, and I know for a fact you like him, at least a little bit. Izuku couldn't help the venom in his tone. It just kept spilling out from his throat. We were finally out of the news for a little bit, and now we are everywhere, more than before. They might have to move again, and Izuku liked it here. He had a home here, in this shitty apartment. The other worry was that they could get caught. And Izuku was angry, his vision practically tinged red, fists clenched so hard they had turned pale, fingernails digging into his skin. Heskin. He ignored the sting, pressing harder so he didn't explode. And perhaps the reason he was so angry is because his anger was swirling around, mixing with his deep fear. He was so scared. Izuku would do anything for Kaizomi, his hero, the person who saved him, made him strong, built him into something from nothing, made Dikairu from Deku, but there was always the creeping doubt, the anxiety, the times where he was alone on a deserted street at 2, 3, 4 in the morning wondering if things would change and flip. If Kaizomi would leave too. He thought of crimson eyes and explosions and kind, green forest eyes turning cold, and he remembered hunger, and he remembered pain. And sometimes he thought about emptiness, the absence of the presence of long, black hair and that unique, crazed look. The absence of Kaizomi. In those moments he always forgot to breathe. Because without Kaizomi, he'd be dead. Kaizomi couldn't do it too. He couldn't leave him behind. But fresh, cool air always reached his lungs eventually. He always came home, and Kaizomi was always a steady presence. There ready and armed with some sarcastic comment, ready to mess up his hair, like a steady force, immovable even against the strongest forces. But this was a tall tsunami of emotion, anger and fear and confusion, and he knew Kaizomi was there, under the waves, but was he still standing? Was he still going to be there, a constant afterwards? Or was Izuku the one being washed away? Did Kaizomi not trust him, or something? Did he do something wrong? Kaizomi had the sense to look ashamed of himself. I'm sorry, but it wasn't exactly on FNG purpose. How does that happen from a FING accident? Izuku made a face, gesturing wildly with his arms. Oh no, I just stabbed a guy, oops. Don't let this be a lie. Don't let us be carried away. They glared at each other for a moment's silence, settling, heavy. Izuku wondered if this was worth it, when he was always destined to be let down. Quirkless Deku, you really let yourself hope? You are nothing. Kaizomi was the first to say anything. At least let me explain, will you? Izuku had nothing but time. It was hard to sleep, what with a million thoughts running through his head. It was difficult to just take a break when you were thinking about 3 different things at once. His sleep was already a lost cause at this point. He had had a 20-minute nap, and now he was practically buzzing with energy. He didn't quite know what to do, but maybe he could take a leaf out of Izuku's book and just walk around. Hosu was bustling at this time of day, business people running around like headless chickens trying to get a cheap lunch as quick as possible, and as a result, hero presence was higher than usual, but what with the sports festival needing extra heroes, the Ida 10 agency were the only people patrolling. Kaizome didn't really mind. These were mostly true heroes, he had no issue with them, and even if he did, this was not the time nor place to do anything. Keeping mainly within the quieter spots, he weaved in and out of the crowd, mainly enjoying the fresh air and sound, a lot of chatter surrounding what people knew of the sports festival. He filtered most of that out, it wasn't something he was all that interested in, and no doubt he would be able to hear all about it from Izuku later. He was enjoying the smell of both fast food and fresh food being cooked, enjoying the snippets of conversations he was getting. He mused about whether or not he should get something to eat himself, but the lines were too long and the people too pushy. Wading his way through the crowd towards the train station, he turned into a slightly quieter street so that he didn't have to risk getting caught just to get to a train station. He was already out and about, he might as well go talk to Jiren or Dabi about Matsubara. He was getting close to the guy's main operations and he wanted him dead as soon as possible. It was when he pulled out a phone to send Izuku a message about where he was going that he collided with an honestly unnecessary amount of metal. Metal that was connected to armor. Ingenium. Of course, if his sidekicks were crawling the place, he wasn't going to be far behind. Usually, that is something he admired about the man, but today it is unfortunate. And annoying. The hero seems like he's recovering from his entire costume reverberating on his body, and he had dropped his phone, which he had apparently been watching while walking around, presumably the reason they had collided, given that neither of them were paying attention. Kaizome uses the hesitation to duck past the hero. Walking a few paces normally, but when it looks like the hero is turning around, he books it. He's not getting caught today, no sir. He hears the hero's sounds of confusion, but before long he can hear the hero pursuing him, thankfully without his speed quirk, yet. Kaizome forces his legs to push harder. Decidedly not looking back, he heads to the gap between a few residential buildings, because he can already feel the eyes on him on the street. Drawing too much attention would create another problem. He knows that there is a wide fire escape in this building that doesn't have appropriate safety measures. He could get the guy to follow him up here and just let him fall. He glanced up at the fire escape before he started climbing. Yeah, the fall probably wouldn't kill him. He backed up against the wall, right next to the entrance of the stairs. He wouldn't be immediately visible when Ingenium entered. And when the hero walked in, steps cautious, helmet nowhere to be seen, indicating that he was probably just getting on or off of his patrol. It took less than 10 seconds for him to be spotted, thankfully. And, thanks to the lack of a helmet, Kaizome registered the recognition in his eyes as he realized who he was. Well, that made things slightly more annoying. Or interesting. Depends on how you look at it. The hero almost immediately leapt at him, armor making a horrible clunking noise as he moved. Leaping out of the way and up the stairs onto a rectangular landing between the next flight of stairs, managing to pull out the knives hidden in his sleeves, only stumbling a little bit over the half-missing stair. What are you doing, hero killer? What are you playing at? He wondered if the hero had any idea that he wasn't playing at anything, and that this was totally a fuck-up on his part. He dodged an attempt at his capture, trying to get the hero off balance enough to fall over the short railing so he could make his escape. The hero unfortunately had commendable balance. Wow, you would think having that much metal on you would make you tip over a bit easier, especially moving at such high speed so often. He must have killer core strength. As much as he wanted to ask a couple of questions, wow, Izuku really was rubbing off on him, maybe ramble on about something about accidents and meddlesome heroes. He couldn't quite let such a good hero think he was the target of an attack from him. Heroes were quite irrational, sometimes, despite how good or bad they might be. Stupid to. In his distraction he managed to get messily tackled to the ground, Ingenium trying not to let either of them fall off. Because the hero was panicked about falling, rather than grabbing his arms, he had pinned him down by his shoulders. We are both going to fall, and it will be your fault. Stop and surrender now. He really didn't want to fall, wow. Kaizome had no such reservations. Ingenium looked away from him, maybe looking around for backup or something. It didn't matter, especially when he managed to get one of his arms far enough to grasp the knife that had fallen out of his hand as he was pinned to the warm metal of the stairs. He managed to get his other hand where armor was shielding ribs, sticking his fingers into the crevasses in the metal, using the leverage to shove him off as he stood up. Ingenium unceremoniously hit the landing as Kaizome flung himself up, a loud noise echoing between the buildings. Triple F dashed. The hero panted as he stood, and Kaizome noticed flames begin to flicker at the engines protruding from his arms. Shit, he needed to end this quickly. The only place that he could realistically draw blood from was his face, so he needed him to stop moving, otherwise anything Kaizome did had a chance of greater injury, and really all Kaizome needed was to escape. He had never come here to harm anyone. He leapt at the hero, knocking him back down. They were both a bit too close to falling down for comfort, but as long as Ingenium was smart enough to not struggle, they would be fine. Stop please. The knife dug a little deeper as the cheek moved. Kaizome avoided eye contact as he carved a thin line down Ingenium's cheek. And sure, it was slower and deeper than it needed to be, but neither of them needed to be here, so it was fair. Thankfully, he didn't move, likely also realizing the fall would hurt quite a bit. As he used the blood to activate his quirk, feeling the hero still beneath him, he stood, thinking. Realistically, he should just leave now. He had no business here anymore. But this shouldn't be happening. HB had always done his best, had always done his FNG best to be good, so why? You go around claiming that heroes are fake and that society is doomed, but you really are no better than the heroes you kill, claiming that they are the filth of society. Kaizome paid him no mind. Those men and women saved people, and you ended that. He should just leave before he started getting emotional. Ingenium needed to start looking below the surface, but that wasn't his responsibility. They had families that mourned them. Kaizome threw the knife that had previously been lodged in his boot at Ingenium's chest. It stuck upright in the white metal, but fortunately or unfortunately, hadn't really gotten deep at all. The sharp intake of breath shocked him out of his thoughts. Stop please. Kaizome averted his eyes. A sight so pathetic it was painful. He had barely done anything, and here Ingenium was pleading. All he could think of was Tenya. Poor Tenya, his idolized view of his big brother would be quickly shattered. Stop this. You know I'm right. It took everything in him not to throw another knife straight at his face. Taking a deep breath, he regathered his thoughts. Time to go. He turned on his heel, leaping down the stairs 2 at a time. He ran the rest of the way home, ignoring the sirens and the loud crash of metal and human on concrete. He wasn't far enough to miss the scream, though. Kaizome really didn't think a teenager was allowed to have such a good, I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed face. He was supposed to be the parental figure or whatever here, so why was Izuku the one with all of the parental facial expressions? It was hardly fair. Izuku finally sighed, breaking eye contact. Well, at least you weren't actually intending on doing something stupid. Kaizome smirked. But no, Kaizome, stop that. But, as I was saying, that doesn't mean there weren't easier ways to resolve that, you idiot. He groaned. Come on, I'm sorry. Really, I am. Izuku rolled his eyes. I know, but you are cooking for the next 3 weeks. Oh, come on. Tensei was chatty, despite his predicament. He had fallen from a great height, no one had said quite how high, but it was high enough, and now he would probably never walk again. He would never be a hero again. And despite everything, despite Tensei being just there, he was right there, alive. Ingenium was dead. Tensei was right across the room from him, very much living, breathing, but that was just that. Ingenium was dead, and the hero killer had succeeded.